Good morning, everybody. I hope that you can see me and hear me okay. Welcome to our panel, Gatekeepers and Game Changers, How Women Matter for Promoting Equitable Change. My name is Aisha Khan. I'm with the Collective for Social Science Research in Karachi. And my co-panelist, my co-convener of this panelist is Sohaila Nazneen of the Institute for Development Studies.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sohaila Nazneen, and I hope you can see me and hear me, and let's hope that the technology cooperates with us. So welcome to the first session of our panel. So we also have a session in the afternoon at 2 o'clock, and we hope that you can join us for that. Just a few admin stuff. If you are having technological difficulties, please let Douglas know, who is our volunteer, and use the chat function for that. For basically how the sessions would run is, in this session we have 4 papers. So we'll have the presentations, and then we have with us Georgina Whalen to comment on the papers, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. We are running a tight ship, so we hope that our presentations will be we'll give you the needed information, but also if you need clarifications, you can use Q&A or the questions functions for that. So we will keep an eye on that. Just to say that the first session of this panel focuses more on how women emerge as critical actors and how they use informal networks and networking to push gender equality agenda through, and also what factors sort of influences them becoming or emerging as leaders. We do, some of the papers focus on then the pushback against using and pushing through gender equality agenda, and what the oppositional actors are doing. So that theme then links to the second session, which looks at feminist movement in difficult contexts, particularly conflict-affected contexts or transitional contexts, and the backlash against women's rights. So that's sort of how the panels are connected. We bring together lots of different kinds of findings and research from different research programs. So the 3 papers you're going to hear in this session, the first 3 papers were a part of a phase 2 study of effective states and inclusive development research center, which is based at University of Manchester. So we are happy to present these findings. I'm very excited about them. The last paper, which is presented by Rebecca Gordon, is based on her PhD research. And then about the second session, if you come into the second session, you'll find out where we got our findings from. So welcome, and we're really excited to have you here.
So I am now going to welcome our first speaker, who is Amon Ashaba Emwini. He is a lecturer at the School of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University in Uganda. His research and teaching interests are in the fields of gender equality policymaking and critical masculinity studies. Dr. Josephine Ahikiri is associate professor at Makerere University, and she co-wrote the presentation which you'll be hearing. I'm just going to open it for you now, and I hope that you enjoy.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I hope I'm audible. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. So I'll go straight into the presentation. The paper is right there, Gender Equitable Change and the Place of Informal Networks in Uganda's Legislative Policy Reform. I wrote this paper with Josephine Ashide, who hasn't been part of us because she is on leave. I think she has been handling a lot of the university administrative functions in the lockdown. So a few weeks ago, she went on leave. but I'm glad to proceed with this. Next slide, please. So this paper basically draws from Uganda's history around gender equity policy, which we note as uneven in the sense of different ups and downs, certain policies going through, others resisted. But we look particularly at the period around 1990s to that. And in this paper, we compare two policy cases. The first one, spousal co-ownership of property. This has been popularly referred to as the lost clause. It is a clause that appeared in the 1997 Land Bill, which became a Land Act in 1998. But the clause got lost at the signing of the actual law. We compare that with the Domestic Violence Act. It was also a domestic violence bill in 2008 and 2009, and it was passed into an act of parliament in 2010. So we compare these two, and in that comparison, we'll try to look at how women emerge as critical actors in these policy reforms. We'll look at the nature of each of these reforms, particularly looking at the kind of resistance that these policy reforms generated. Resistance, but also counter-resistance in the process. And we look at how women drew on informal networks to navigate massive resistance that they were experiencing. And when we talk about informal networks, we draw on the work of Helmi and Levitsky, who write about formal institutions, but particularly look at these as socially shared rules and norms that are often unwritten. They are created and communicated, and they are enforced largely outside the officially sanctioned channels. So you will have things like backdoor deals, you will have personal negotiations or drawing on key personalities in the policymaking arena in order to push for a particular bill or law, or in order to resist a particular reform. Next slide, please. Why informal networks? We draw on the work of feminist institutionalists such as Georgina Whelan, who look at informal aspects of institutions. And in this case, they particularly look at personal relationships, bureaucratic and legislative norms, bending of formal rules, backdoor deals. But they argue that these kinds of informal practices in the policy arena are often less visible, they are often taken for granted by actors therein, yet they influence what gets accepted or resisted within the policy arena. So this is the kind of conceptual frame that we draw on. So in this paper, as Sohera had already shared with us, it drew on a number of methods that involved key informant interviews from the women's movement, individual women activists in parliament. It also drew on desk-based literature and the analysis of parliamentary records that relate to these two policy reforms that we're looking at. And we also looked at media reports, especially how they were capturing the debating, the framing of these policy reforms, and the actions that different actors engaged in as they promoted or resisted these reforms. And in a way, we explore the kinds of informal networks and practices that were drawn upon during these policy reforms, networks and practices that were both promoting, but also those that were countering these policy reforms. And we also look at the conditions that enabled or constrained policy change. Next slide, please. So we draw from that broader history in Uganda around gender equity policy reforms, largely noting the 1981-85 guerrilla war. That was a guerrilla movement that brought the current regime in power around 1986. And that is not to say that gender equity reforms began that time, but for purposes of being able to share this presentation, we say let's start from that point, which has a lot of significance, especially in terms of how women emerged. We note that women participated in that liberation war and gained public entry into politics, but we also note that the war had its own unintended consequences, as some of the feminists like Ali Mary Tripp have indicated, that wars and conflicts usually have disruptive character. They disrupt social relations, particularly gender relations, and provide opportunities for women to engage and participate in public politics. In this case, we draw on one of the reforms, constitutional review process of 1989 to 1994, which brought the current constitution in place. We note that women participated in this constitutional review. They went countrywide, consulting women's constituency, consulting communities. And out of this process, we saw a vibrant women's movement emerging. But we also saw women collectively articulating particular concerns that touched their lives, everyday lives, especially in a state that has been historically, written and articulated as patriarchal. Particularly, we note the 1995 Constitution, which was described as the most gender sensitive at the time it came in power in 1995. This constitution outlawed discrimination on the basis of sex. It named women as citizens of an equal worth. It acknowledged women's rights as human rights, but largely it institutionalized a language of gender equality in the public discourse. And all this review process created a sense of optimism and postured Uganda as a state committed to gender equality at that time. Next slide, please. So in terms of the spousal co-ownership clause, which we refer to as the lost clause in the 1998 Land Act, this clause originated from the 1995 Constitution, which had provided that within the 2 years of this constitution coming in place, Uganda should have a law on land, providing for tenure, ownership, and management of land in the country. So women seized this opportunity and drew on the sense of optimism at that moment and suggested a clause where women, married women, would co-own property, family property, particularly land, where the family derived its sustenance with their husbands. We note that the framing of this co-ownership clause drew so much, was by women's movement actors, particularly individual women in parliament. We have Honorable Miriam Matembe at the center of the framing of this clause, to the effect that this clause at some stage came to be called Matembe clause. We had the likes of Honorable Winnie Byanyima at the time. So as they framed this, they looked at co-ownership within the context of marriage and around issues of identity and belonging. In their argument, they were looking for a clause that would provide for a place for women, that would provide for legitimizing women's ownership of land where the family resided and enable them to have a place of belonging. On the other side, we had the broader land bill being framed by political elites as an around land as an economic resource, with an aim of fostering marketability of land and promoting overall economic development. Unfortunately, as you look through these two, the broader land bill and the smaller clause, these kinds of agendas were in conflict with each other. And we shall see how the promoting of the co-ownership ran in conflict with the broader land bill, as I will show it, in the slides that are coming. But on that side, you see a number of actors, actors who were both supporting the clause, but also those who were against the co-ownership of land. We note that the women's activists in parliament were key, women's organizations were key in the framing and supporting of this, but also the umbrella Uganda Land Alliance, which was an umbrella of civil society organizations promoting land rights. But we also see those against largely political elites led by the President Yoweri Museveni, and his cabinet at the time. Next slide, please. So in the co-ownership clause, this slide, we highlight the kinds of resistances, the kinds of framings and the resistances they generated. We wanted to do it in that binary form to show how the pro-gender equity forces, what they did, but also the kind of resistance, intense resistance their actions generated. We have women conducting research on women's land rights, which same research was often trivialized by political elites as emotionally driven and elitist and not representing the broader category of women in Uganda. But we also have these women's rights organizations still organizing workshops where they brought women from communities to give testimonies on how they were deprived of land. And these were women strategically collected from communities where members of parliament were resistant to this co-ownership clause. So they will be brought in a workshop together with members of parliament who were against. We had, through these workshops, the government, largely political elites, looking at co-ownership, arguing that co-ownership clause is acceptable, but it is largely domestic, and it should be kept for another bill, which was domestic relations bill, which had been resisted for a long time. So they said instead of putting it in a bill that is largely economic, it should be put into domestic relations bill, which was tactical in a way of delaying and sort of shelving it alongside the issues that were shelved in the domestic relations bill. Then we had the women reframing the ownership and arguing that, look, women's ownership of land is actually economic from the perspective of women being dominant actors in agriculture and being the dominant labor force, and arguing that actually these actions inhibited women's productivity. We had quite a number of actions there. Women appealing to the male constituency to do it for their daughters. Matembe urging fellow women in parliament that if they cannot support this clause, they should at least not be seen openly on the floor of parliament in opposition. Next slide, please. So we have on the other side Domestic Violence Act, which originated from the Domestic Relations Bill, a broader bill. So in 2008, we had the women's movement and the Law Reform Commission splitting this broader bill into three small pieces of legislation. One was the Domestic Violence Bill. We note that actually the splitting of this bill was much more political and tactical. And it was intended, it was driven by the women's movement, but also by the political elites, because it was intended to trim the domestic relations bill of the controversies that the political elites disagreed with. And there were, quite a number of framings that enabled the passage of this domestic violence bill, unlike its predecessor bill, which was resisted. First of all, we had domestic violence framed as sin. We had the president coming now from resisting the former bill to saying that battering wives, men were breaking the law, sort of, constituting domestic violence bill as criminal. And then we saw domestic violence as bad for economic development, but also drawing on narratives that men too were affected by domestic violence. And some of these strategies were promoted by women activists in order to at least have a certain gender equitable law on the laws of Uganda. And there were lots of strategies they engaged in: coalition building, drawing on men to speak to these issues, mobilizing voices from rural areas, and mobilizing donor support, as well as speaking to religious organizations, churches and mosques, to support violence, because it was disintegrating the family as a unit. Next slide. So in the interest of time, I want to quickly summarize on whether informal networks matter. We note that on the co-ownership clause, though the debate and although the clause was debated and agreed on the floor of Parliament, the clause did not appear in the final act that was assented to by the President. But on the other side, the Domestic Violence Act was accepted and passed into law, although we note that it did not have a lot to do with implementation mechanism. We note that the informal networks mattered, especially in their absence. Women did not engage into a lot of informal networking at this point. And we note that this could have been probably because the women's movement and the women broadly had seen Uganda as a state committed to promoting gender equality, and they thought that engaging with the state in a formal way would deliver gender equality, which was unfortunately not the case. But the interviews that we had, especially with Matembe, indicated that the loss of this clause was indeed a bigger lesson that enabled them as individual women in parliament, but also as the movement to look at how to engage with the next gender equity reforms. In terms of conclusion, the last slide, please. We note that the informal networks matter in varied ways, especially for pro-change forces, but also for those opposed to gender equity reforms. We also argue that informal networks have implications on the framing of the kind of gender equity policies that are adopted. Unfortunately, in this kind of negotiations and compromises, there is also a potential for backlashes, the rollback of certain feminist gains in policy arena. But most importantly, as we conclude, is that the feminist analysis of hidden and taken for granted rules, norms, and practices is an important step towards challenging deep-seated resistance, particularly relating to policies that attract a lot of resistances, especially when they are supported by traditional cultures, religious doctrines, and those kind of doctrines that resist change towards gender equality. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very enlightening and interesting piece of research. I would now like to invite Deepak Thapa, who will be speaking he's the Director of Social Sciences, Baha, and he will be speaking on, let me just try and bring him up 1 second. Here we go. He will be, he writes regularly on Nepal's contemporary social and political issues. And his most recent publication is the edited collection, The Politics of Change, Reflections on Contemporary Nepal. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Aisha and Sohela, for organizing this panel. I will dive straight into the presentation, if I can have it up on screen, please. Okay, the next one. The story I'm about to tell you is about three policies and laws which have had very far-reaching impacts on gender equality and equity in Nepal. And the story, of course, sounds very linear as I tell it, and sounds as if like it was meant to happen, but obviously in real life, it did not pan out the way it did. It is a collective effort that was that saw the engagement of a large number of groups and people over a period of nearly 2 decades. The three issues that we're looking at is the school sector reform plan, the Domestic Violence Crime and Punishment Act, the Domestic Violence Act, and the amendment to the National Code that was done in 2002, ensuring equal inheritance rights to women. We're looking at the various actors that were involved and the kind of strategies that they engaged in to get these three key legislations passed. Next, please. Another one. The school sector reform plan. As with most policies in Nepal, there is always an international element to it, mainly because Nepal has been very good at taking part in various international fora and signs up to all kinds of international conventions and agreements, as a result of which there is a lot of pressure that is built within Nepal to amend our own laws to bring them in line with what we are committed to. Hence, the school sector reform plan also has its genesis back in the 1990 World Declaration of Education for All, which led to the primary education project, which saw 2 phases with the support of a number of donors, including the Danes and the World Bank primarily. And the idea was basically to provide access. And then, of course, like in terms of gender, we had providing scholarships to girls and other marginalized groups. And that was followed by the Education for All, the Dhaka framework. And the National Plan of Action that was adopted in 2000 to last for 15 years had elements of gender equality throughout in its objectives. Next, please. Of course, like given that these were the basic primary and education project, being the donor-funded project, we had a lot of evaluations of the project itself. And of course, one of these, the gender audit, found out that education for all was not being possible, mainly because of the inherent gender inequality. Hence, there were various attempts made in the Education Action Plan to create a greater level of gender equity elements in these projects. If you look at the last 2 points, the school sector reform program plan, which came out of all these deliberations, had 2 major developments, which was providing scholarships to girls, which were very small amounts, but for a poor country like Nepal, it was served as a very powerful incentive. The other was providing separate toilets for girls. The girls did not go to school because they could not access toilets. So there was all of these came out in the gender audit, and this was something that has been taken quite seriously. Next, please. Likewise, with the Domestic Violence Act, we signed CEDAW in 1991, which led to a number of developments. Primarily, the women's cells were formed within the Nepal Police. After the Beijing Conference, the Ministry of Women and Social Welfare was created. Until then, we had something called the Social Welfare Council, which used to look after women's and other quote-unquote soft issues. So it was around 1995 that a draft of a Domestic Violence Act was drafted by a group of extra-government people, women activists and lawyers, who were sometimes one and the same. The draft was handed over to the Social Welfare Council, but it was lost by the government officials, so there was no discussion on that at all. Next one, please. But then after the Ministry of Women and Social Welfare was formed, the domestic violence issue was taken up with greater gusto. And then 3 years later, a draft bill was attempted to be drafted. 2 years later, it was tabled in Parliament and further improved. And it had already been passed by the lower house and was under consideration by the upper house when the king at the time dissolved the parliament. So we didn't have a parliament to actually take this up. And of course, like, at the same time, since 1996, we had a Maoist insurgency. So that also led to a political crisis that put everything on the back burner. Regarding the Domestic Violence Act, as well as the inheritance rights, one important push factor has to be considered the Maoist movement, because one of the main planks it was campaigning for the hearts and minds was ending violence against women through actions such as declaring large parts of the country dry, because alcohol was seen as one of the major causes of domestic violence. And also because the country's legal system did not always function very well, they set up a parallel system in which men were taken to task very quickly for abusing their wives. And the Domestic Violence Act was finally passed in 2009, which was, again, after the Maoist insurgency had ended. Next one, please. The inheritance rights obviously had a much longer provenance. We first saw elements of that with something called the Nepal Marriage Bill, which was introduced in 1954, but it was too ahead of its time and certainly doomed to fail, and it did fail. It was only after the 1975 and the Declaration of the Decade of Women that we saw the country code being amended. And women, if they were aged 35 and over, were allowed to claim access to parental property, provided that they remained unmarried. Provided they were unmarried, and if they got married subsequently, they had to return the property. And in 1993, we saw the advent of the PIL, the public interest litigations, which was used repeatedly by women activists in their fight for equal rights. So 1993 saw the first one. 2 years later, the Supreme Court gave a ruling in favor of the PIL. Next one, please. Okay, something's happened. Anyway, so the Supreme Court ordered the government to introduce a bill that would amend laws that were discriminatory towards women. And in 1996, we had a small leftist party that introduced a bill calling for women's abortion rights and property rights. I'm sorry. There were a number of reforms also around that time, which was a direct impact of the Maoist insurgency. The main being the setting up of the National Women's Commission in 2001. And it was around that time, because of the Maoist insurgency, there was pressure on the government to introduce much more gender equitable policies that the women MPs at the time were able to push through the amendment to the country code in 2002, which removed the age bar on women to inherit parental property. But obviously, they were not able to get rid of the clause where they had to return the property if they got married. But importantly, they also established, the amendment also established women's right to equal property of her husband immediately after marriage. So it was not something that the husband could give, but it was automatically they were equal partners to the property. And of course, the main one of the main gains was the right of women to seek divorce from the husband for harassing physically and psychologically, and of course, like for having affairs with other women. Next one, please. So I will quickly run through the actors. I'll just go to the last two slides after this. But just to say that the school sector reform plan did not have much resistance from any quarter. It was a noble endeavor to provide girls' education. But what I should simply point out is that despite the lack of opposition, it would not have been possible. Many of these measures would not have been possible if there had not been a large group of women who were part of the national legislature. So after 2008, by law, 33% of the national of legislators, either at the province or at the federal level, have to be women. So there is a large contingent of women who ensure that these measures are implemented. Next one, please. The issue of domestic violence and inheritance, these were kind of seen as similar in terms of focus, and it was more or less the same group of actors who were involved in getting both these rights passed. After 1990, when civil society was becoming more active, and we saw the growth of NGOs and NGO networks, that led to a lot of pressure building brought to bear on the government and the donor community as well. Next one, please. I'm just ending with a couple of slides here to show the importance of very personal links that were instrumental in getting both these rights passed into law. One of the key individuals was someone called Arzu Rana Deoba, who has been a feminist activist for a long time. But in the early 90s, she got married to this guy, Sherbaz Deoba, who was the home minister at that time. And she was able to leverage, and she also runs one of the largest, the biggest women's rights NGOs in Nepal. So together with the network that she had and the clout that she could bring to bear through her husband, who was the home minister at that time, and immediately after, like a couple of years after they got married, he became prime minister. She was able to bring to bear a lot of pressure on the government. One of them was in 2002 when she was able to convince the prime minister to pressure the king to provide approval to the 11th amendment that had been passed by Parliament, providing inheritance rights. Likewise, her husband was the prime minister when the Ministry of Women and Children was formed in 1995, and he was once again the prime minister in 2001 when the National Women's Commission was established. And that goes to some distance in explaining how some of these policies that a lot of people thought would not see the light of day for a long time was able to be passed by the Parliament, or brought in as policy. Next one, please. The other important factor is this. We had two parties, the Nepali Congress, which is what Deoba is from, and the other major party was the Nepal Communist Party. of which one of the prominent members was someone called Bidya Devi Bhandari. She is now the president of Nepal, but in 2006 she was only an MP. And she tabled a motion for resolution that these 4 clauses be adopted by Parliament as something that would guide the future policy making. So guaranteeing a third participation of women in all state mechanisms, which has been fulfilled to some extent, as I mentioned, through the election law. Children being able to claim citizenship either through the father, a mother, or the father. It used to be only the father earlier. That has, to some extent, been fulfilled. Anti-women laws were to be repealed. So we had something called what we call the Gender Equality Law, passed in 2006 itself, which saw more than 50 different laws of the country being amended in line with the provisions of that law. And the one of the major factors was the end to violence against women. It took 3 years for the Domestic Violence Act to be passed, but the country did get there. The last one, please. Bidya Bhandari was instrumental in getting this the Parliament to start deliberating these issues. She was the widow of the General Secretary of that party, who had been killed in 1993 in a car accident. And she was also very close to the current Prime Minister, K.P. Sharma Oli, who is now the Prime Minister. And it was actually because of her very close links with the Prime Minister that she is now the president. But of course, like the fact that the story I'm telling you is more about the legislative part. But then there's a large number of women activists, particularly working through NGOs and NGO networks, who were instrumental in providing not only the kind of the firepower through the media and so on, but also in terms of bringing women politicians together to educate them on new developments happening on women's rights. The last point I want to make is obviously that implementation has been a problem, as one can imagine. But then we certainly have moved quite a far distance compared to the 1990s. At one time in Nepal, we had the president who was a woman. The Speaker of the House was Speaker of Parliament was a woman, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a woman. So in effect, all 3 branches of government were headed by women. But obviously, the president is only a titular figure, the Prime Minister being the more powerful person. But that shows that acceptance of women in leadership positions has become kind of the norm now. Although, at the ground level, implementation is still a problem. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deepak, for your very interesting talk. Sorry for the little bit of a lag time in hearing something, but I hope everybody could follow Deepak's interesting presentation very well. Thank you. I will now invite Sohaila to come up and give her presentation on her presentation is called Exceptional Women, Women's Leadership and Informal Networks, and Policy Change in Bangladesh. Let me just bring up the presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Aisha. I'll just use my privilege as the co-convener of the panel to say, if you do have questions, keep them coming in the sense that put them in the question, use the question function, and we are keeping an eye on it because we know we are presenting and this is a visual medium, and at times just listening to our voices may seem a little bit hard. So do keep the questions coming, even though we haven't opened up the floor yet. So that's just a caveat. And Aisha, keep me on a tight time leash because I know we have another Rebecca's presentation, and I would want her to have enough time to make her presentation, and then also for Georgina to make her comments and for a Q&A session. So having said that, my focus is on Bangladesh. Aisha, can we go to the next slide? So this is just the background, and I've already talked about it. It's a part of a larger comparative research that we were doing in 3 countries, and you've already heard Aman talk about Uganda and Deepak talk about Nepal in terms of the policy changes and the role of women as critical actors, and then also looking at informal networks. In Bangladesh, we worked with BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, and Mahin is here with us, who is my co-researcher in Bangladesh, and then Progga, who sadly cannot join us today, but she was also part of the team. Could we go to the next slide? So basically, just to flag that our research had many different aspects, and we are only presenting one slice of one aspect of that research. So basically, what I'm asking in the Bangladesh presentation is, how do powerful women matter? So in terms of when you are a woman leader, a critical actor, how do you matter? And how do their informal networks matter in the policy changes that we look at? Next slide, please, Aisha. So just to give you a little bit of context about Bangladesh, a lot of you know about it, but those of you who are not familiar with the Bangladesh context, there has been lots of significant gains made in terms of women's empowerment, particularly in terms of social development. So if you look at sort of falling fertility rates, rise in labor force participation, you probably know about our garment workers, also microcredit, but also sort of looking at gender parity in education and various laws passed to address violence against women. That doesn't mean that we don't have problems. We have lots of problems, but gains have also been made at quite a faster rate. In terms of politics, we have 2 major parties, the Awami League and the BNP. In recent years, there has been a sort of a shift from sort of the 2-party sort of system that we see towards Awami League emerging as the dominant party. But despite democracy being there since 1991, it's still a clientelist context, so you have to matter as a collective group. And the question is, do women matter as a collective group? Recently, we have also seen sort of a trend towards limiting space for sort of oppositional dissent, and also sort of questioning from civil society organizations. There's a long legacy of women's movement, and women's movement having forcing all sorts of change, even despite being led by professional middle-class women, and sort of in terms of numbers, if you compare to other kinds of movements, probably a smaller, numerically small, but having quite a bit of influence in the policy space. In the recent years, also, we have seen a shift and rise of Islamist groups in politics, and Islamist civil society groups, and that is an important factor to consider, partly because they do have a veto power. They don't have electoral strength, but they do have a veto power in terms of how you shape issues around women's rights, particularly those require or touch on cultural issues. And of course, we used to be a donor-dependent country, but there is a diminishing sort of donor influence, partly because our aid budget is not as big in terms of the influence it has in the overall sort of economic basket. If you look at it's more, it has, the percentage has fallen. Aisha, next slide, please. So basically, this is the policy change table. So we look at 2 policies. One is the Domestic Violence Act, which is common as you have seen in Uganda and Nepal. We have looked at it. The other one is National Women's Development Policy. And you can see that these, the Domestic Violence Act is a recent act. I'm calling it recent, although it was passed in 2010. The policy coalition to push this through, even though the women's movement was working on it for a long time, was actually formed in 2007. There was a coalition that's called the Citizens Initiative Against Domestic Violence, that was formed of different women's rights groups, human rights groups, child rights groups. So it had a wide range in terms of alliances. Key areas of contestation in the public space was around, how do you define a family? Does it include cohabiting couples? What about gay couples? There was an issue around right to residence. So do married women have a right to reside, even if they are over the marital home? Sort of debates around what should be the punishment length if a husband has been very violent, and issues around marital rape, which was excluded. The key resistors in terms of, even though women's ministry was pushing this, the resistance came from the Ministry of Law in the parliament when it was debated, from male MPs, and then some cabinet ministers in terms of actors. In terms, if we look at National Women's Development Policy, this was framed in 1997. It went through several amendments, so that indicates that there were lots of sort of contentions around that. The policy coalition that was formed was in 2010. It's called the SPC. The main areas of contention was around inheritance and also asset ownership. Basically, the key resistors here was the Islamist civil society group, particularly post-2010, which is called Hifazat Islam, and then sort of the political parties these groups were allied to, and also cabinet ministers. Next slide, please, Aisha. So basically, the first question is, do powerful women matter, and are they game changers, and how do they matter? Next slide, please, Aisha. So basically, a lot of the time we do sort of raise issues, particularly in the quota debate, that what are women doing? These women came in, what are they doing? In the Bangladesh case, it's very clear that powerful women do matter in specific ways. Depends on who that person is and where they're positioned. So for our case on domestic violence, the informal networks that the women's movement leaders had with the women's minister and the prime minister became very, very important. The women's minister, because of her positional power as the head of the women's ministry, although women's ministry is not always a powerful ministry, became a very important actor in terms of channeling information about what's going on in the cabinet. The prime minister was a key actor in terms of diffusing resistance in the parliament, but also sort of in the cabinet, sort of informally letting people know that I want this law passed for whatever reasons, whether that's instrumental or ideological, we can debate that. But the positional power of these women mattered quite a lot. And the interpersonal capital that the women's movement leaders had, and the links they had with these key actors in different places, created a kind of trust in terms of what information was being exchanged, what are you asking actors to do, what needed to move. And then some men also emerged as critical actors, particularly the project head on the multi-sectoral project on violence against women, based at the women's ministry, because the law became something that was created that was a deliverable for this project. So it provided a particular kind of funding to do the work. So while we see critical actors matter and informal networks matter, obviously there are limitations to this. So for the National Women's Development Policy, which touched on inheritance issues, it became difficult at certain point to sort of retain that clause or have that clause sort of over the period of time. So the 1997 policy mentions it, and then it's gone. So it depends on the nature of policy change that you're asking for, and how does that challenge male power. Now you might say domestic violence also challenges male power, but in the way the issue was framed, this was about sort of ensuring well-being of the families. Men also are affected by violence. It hampers development, and nobody at that point of time in Bangladesh would come out and say, yes, it's okay to beat your wife. But yes, it's problematic if you're talking about inheritance and my sister gets it. And then, of course, what are the political costs? So who is resisting? Whether you can stare down internal party resistance, whether you think the public will go along with you. And then if you have the Islamist groups sort of forming a coalition and a strong resistance against it, which is what we see in the National Women's Development Policy case, then it becomes very difficult. Next slide, please, Aisha. So the next slide focuses, or this part focuses on the gatekeepers. I talked about game changers, so the critical actors, but who are the ones resisting and what are they doing? Could we go to the next slide, Aisha? So basically, you need to think about resistance and unpack resistance. A lot of the time, when we look at Muslim majority countries, we know that if Islamist groups play a big role in the public space, that they would have a specific type of voice. And then, of course, you see the big demonstrations and you sort of see what they're doing on the streets. But they also use lots of informal strategies, just as women's movement actors do, to get access to policy spaces. They use their interpersonal capital, they use their informal channels within the political parties, with the prime minister, with different ministries to push back against certain issues. There are basically informal strategies that are used, and sometimes it's about co-opting your language, that when you're using the language of equality and you're promoting women's rights, co-opting that language and saying that, you know, Islam is fair and it gives sort of women certain kinds of spaces and certain kinds of rights, and it leads to empowerment. So you're taking on the concept of empowerment. And this co-optation issue will come up also in the second session at 2:00. Certain papers will touch on it. There is targeted harassment of women's rights activists, and also framing and labeling gender equality actors or advocates as anti-Islamists, which we know is a key strategy that is used against backlash against women, and also informal sort of moral arguments being used. Do you want the family to be broken up, etc.? We are all familiar with that, the strategies of backlash. But the issue that got us really interested was that are the oppositional groups better at sort of using their informal networks than sort of the pro-gender equality coalitions? In other words, do they play dirty and do they play it better? Can we have the next slide, please? So basically, these are some final reflections. We know that critical actors matter, but how important are they? And it's partly linked to the kind of change that you're wanting in terms of whether critical actors are able to create that space for you inside the state, or whether they're able to help you push resistance. And we saw the Prime Minister and the Women's Minister's power varied depending on which policy change you were asking for. Personal networks obviously matter, and informal networks obviously matter. Informal networks by themselves can be positive. We saw women's movement actors using it. They can also be negative. We saw the oppositional actors using it. If the issue is about a doctrinal change, which Tunan Weldon talks about, it's always hard because you're challenging male power in a specific way. And then there's also the issue about if you rely so much on informal networks and practices and policy change, which is what we see in the case of women's movement in Bangladesh, then what happens when there's a very public backlash? What are the limits of that? And I will stop there. While Aisha connects, Srilatha, yes, thank you for that comment. That is exactly what we are seeing, and we'll also see it in session 2 when the papers are presented.
Hello. I'm not sure whether it's just me that can't hear Aisha, but I'll start with my presentation. Thank you so much for all the presentations so far. They've been really, really, really interesting. I've enjoyed listening to them a lot. So our presentation is entitled, It Starts with Educating a Girl and Hopefully Ends with a Woman Leader, Transformative Political Leadership for Girls' Education. Next slide, please. And this work was undertaken for the Platform for Girls' Education, and with the key aim of wanting, the kind of platform was set up to want to influence and achieve 12 years of quality education for all girls. And the key kind of purpose of this research that was undertaken was to provide evidence to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which was to take place this year, which has unfortunately been postponed due to COVID-19. But the work was commissioned by the Foreign Office in the UK and very much supported by the Department for International Development and the United Nations Girls' Education Initiative. So I want to thank firstly all those bodies for their involvement, and also particularly to those members of the Platform for Girls' Education for their commitment and support, and many of them as well for their participation in this research. So the kind of first kind of question, how we got on to doing this research, is kind of why there is a need to focus on political leadership to promote girls' education. So from previous research that we've done for the platform, the benefits for girls' education and of girls' education have been made clear by kind of many different parts of research and papers. And yet we're still seeing kind of 130 million girls denied the right to school, and many as well, when in school, aren't in a safe environment, and many aren't learning the basics. And so there's a growing evidence base in girls' education that's starting to show what works to support the most marginalised girls to achieve and access education. But at this point, we're still not seeing this sufficiently translating into action. And so, although it seems kind of ever more clear that everyone agrees that girls' education is very important, and many of the arguments in this area that have been made by researchers, policymakers, politicians alike have been very persuasive, there are many, many issues that remain intransient, particularly related to social norm change, and kind of the issue with having to translate some of these factors into long-term change and sustainable change. So our research particularly sought to explore this role of political leadership. What role can it play, and what kind of frameworks, priorities and recommendations can particularly be used for mobilising political leaders to take action for girls' education. Next slide, please. So we focused on the concept of transformative leadership, and particularly kind of thinking of this as being vital to dismantle these entrenched power structures that are particularly prevalent in preventing girls from accessing this 12 years of quality education that the Platform for Girls' Education was set up to achieve. And kind of thinking in particular about these associations with feminist approaches to leadership and the struggle to tackle power relations that are very much embedded within societies of cultures. And we drew a lot, benefited a lot from Batliwala's work here. As particularly kind of focus on transformational leadership was recognising that the kind of importance around political leadership for girls' education needed to not only think about legislation and policy change, but also kind of transforming structures and ideologies that justify and perpetuate gender inequality and power imbalances. So whilst there is a narrow focus on girls' education, often at the kind of political level, it's politically salient, the kind of the focus on transformative leadership, we wanted to kind of argue for this need for this transformative lens, as many of the barriers and for girls' education are intersecting, and transformation takes a long time. Next slide, please. So I want to first kind of present this framework, which we used to kind of explore different factors of political leadership for girls' education. And so based on the evidence that was already existing, we draw a lot of really important evidence on political leadership, and also from our interviews from the research. The framework is based on 3 different interconnecting perspectives. So firstly, the importance of individual leaders being motivated to promote girls' education, take these opportunities and to adopt strategic approaches to push for change. Secondly, the importance of these motivated individuals forming and engaging collectively in coalitions that have power, legitimacy and influence, and also using these coalitions to contest ideas underpinning the status quo and to promote change. So in the case of gender equality in education, particularly that kind of tackling of social norms holding back progress. And one of the key kind of findings from the evidence is this importance of collaborative leadership in order to create the widespread and sustained change that's needed. One of the kind of other things that we sort of highlight in this framework is the importance of cross-country coalitions. So given that the restrictive gender norms that have hindered access to education are global, the importance of learning from cross-country coalitions, of cross-national approaches, and what's worked in other countries was a really important aspect of this kind of political leadership. The framework also very much identifies the need for high-level political leaders to engage with a wide range of stakeholders and make space and amplify the voices for such engagement. But whilst this framework sort of was formed from the research that we did, and I kind of use it as a way through which to go through this presentation and present our findings, we do really acknowledge that obviously different types of leadership are valued in different locations, it's very situational, and political systems vary widely from country to country. So this framework is only intended as a guide for what political leadership for girls' education might encompass. Next slide, please. So in terms of the research that we did, we conducted 11 key informant interviews, specifically with senior women political leaders who have been very much involved in championing girls' education. The sampling was purposive and was based on connections and those who were involved in the Platform for Girls' Education. Their interviews were recorded and transcribed, and then we used a process of inductive coding and thematic coding to look and search for themes across interviews to find kind of overarching findings. So firstly, the kind of findings demonstrated who the political leaders are that have an important role to play in supporting girls' education based on the experience of these women leaders who have been working strongly in this area. Next slide, please. So the kind of first key finding really was around the importance of women leaders. And although this is something obviously that we often hear in relation to progress for gender equality, there were kind of a number of themes that came out of the interviews. So firstly, those that we interviewed noted how the visibility of women as political leaders had an important role to play in terms of role modelling, and in particular that it could contribute to longer term shifts in gender norms and social norms that would benefit girls' education. But obviously this is not a panacea, and kind of very much in the interviews there were also conversations that women leaders are not necessarily transformative leaders, might not necessarily support progress in gender or discrimination. And there was one example of a woman minister who was particularly reluctant to bring in a re-entry policy for girls' education. And so, but the kind of evidence from these two quotations that we can see is very much the kind of importance of having women political leaders involved in promoting change for girls' education because of this role modelling effect. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, thank you. We kind of, one of the other things was very much reiterated numerous times by interviewees was the importance of heads of government, so high-level political leadership, having an essential role in advancing gender equality, both by achieving kind of legislative and policy change, but also through their commitment and visibility being vital for promoting social attitudes and stimulating action required to dismantle some of these entrenched power dynamics. It was often talked about the kind of importance of the high-level leadership at the kind of head of state, head of government level, but also through ministers and parliamentarians due to their mandate to develop legislation and policies to accelerate progress. But one of the other things that came out often from the interviewees was the idea that transformative change is likely to take a lot longer than most individual governments and parliamentarians will be in office. And so there's a really, it's really important for the political engagement to occur at all levels. Next slide, please. So the importance of civil servants as playing a really crucial role in providing stability and continuity in the design, development and delivery of policies and programmes for girls' education was highlighted by numerous interviewees. And so one example being Barbara Chilangwa, who is the former permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education in Zambia, spoke particularly about how her earlier role as a civil servant and leading a girls' education programme was very influential in shaping the subsequent actions when she became Deputy Permanent Secretary in charge of technical cooperation. And it was her kind of commitment and experience of working in this area that really enabled her to galvanise support across the ministry for it to be part of their basic education subsector investment programme. Next slide, please. So I'll just, while the slides are stuck, I'll kind of move through a few, just noticing the time left. So one of the things that was often mentioned as a key challenge was that women leaders are often confined to portfolios stereotypically seen as feminine or viewed as low prestige policy areas. And so in particular, our interviewees highlighted that often, you know, even if women become ministers of education, they aren't as able to exercise power within the Ministry of Finance. And this kind of inability to influence budgetary decision making was a key barrier to them being able to progress change for girls' education. Secondly, the kind of influence of gender units and the importance of them in providing a gender lens in education ministries was very important. But the quotes here kind of point out the challenges with this as well, this kind of gender units often not being given the power to actually influence change. Next slide, please. So just kind of a summary of some of the other findings around kind of motivations for action for political leaders, and therefore kind of what we need to think about when working with other political leaders for girls' education, one of the very key and often mentioned by women political leaders was their own personal experience of discrimination or of inequality in education that really motivated them to act for change. Next slide, please. National political and institutional influences were also really important, and voter pressure in particular was a really key example that was often given about motivating high-level political leaders to act. So we can see in this quote from Florence Malingua the importance of sanitary towels being raised as an election campaign issue. And so during this campaign, all the presidential candidates made this announcement to provide free sanitary towels to girls in schools. Next slide, please. Also noted was the kind of importance of data and evidence in campaigns, and kind of really the role of civil society organizations often in presenting and kind of having expertise in this data. And also kind of noted was the importance of this evidence holding political leaders to account, and the kind of ways in which campaigns and advocacies based on this evidence could really target and stimulate new political action on gender equality by either publicizing new information or highlighting political inaction. And then next slide, please. And then the kind of key points that were made in terms of action really needed by political leaders in order to promote girls' education. So very strongly, one of the findings was the importance of networks and coalitions of like-minded political leaders that come together with this aim of achieving common goals, particularly the importance of them in providing stronger collective voice. So the example given in these quotations is of the Forum for African Women Education lists. And initially, Farway brought together key prominent leaders in education to share ideas and experience. And this is kind of translated into continued recognition, positive program examples that have been translated into numerous contexts, and also a kind of collective voice of women leaders calling for action and change. Next slide, please. The importance of engaging with key stakeholders and civil society leaders was also really strongly emphasised, that political leaders need to work very closely with those that understand the challenges of access to girls' education within their own communities, and have the expertise about what action and what change and engagement is needed, particularly in achieving the kind of widespread social norm change that is so important. Next slide, please. And then this kind of importance of a whole system approach was really strongly mentioned. Many of the women leaders noted the difficulties and the challenges they'd had in pushing for being able to push for changes within the ministries they were working in, but that often these kind of barriers to girls' education were really cross-cutting. And so there was real kind of emphasis on the need for cross-ministerial coalitions, and particularly thinking about the kind of barriers to girls' education influenced by factors outside of the education system. And so this cross-ministerial whole system approach was very much emphasised in the need to kind of ensure coherence and accurate development and policies. And then penultimate slide, please. And then kind of obviously one of the key aspects was the importance of prioritisation of adequate and sustainable funding. As Florence Malinga's quote here is that often there was a large commitment to girls' education and a recognition of the importance of using a gender lens in planning, but there was still very often a kind of budgetary challenge. You can have these plans, but they won't be implemented effectively without the financial resources. So some of those interviewed spoke about the importance of gender-based budgeting, gender-responsive budgeting, but also the kind of key role that budgetary commitments to gender equality in education have played, particularly in supporting political leaders' action in this area. And then the final slide, please. So just to summarise, so that transformative political leadership is very necessary, but not sufficient for shifting the needle on education. And in particular, this kind of focus on the need for collective action of individuals who are motivated for change to come together with through within and cross-country coalitions was really highlighted, and the importance of transforming both the formal, the kind of legislation and policy changes, but also the informal and written legislation and the unwritten gender norms. And then finally, that kind of the concluding point, very much spoken about the importance of women leaders having the potential to change social norms that are holding back progress in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for that, Rebecca. There were some issues with getting the slides turned in time.
No worries.
It just got a bit stuck on our end. Thank you very much for that really interesting and very rich presentation. I am now going to invite Professor Georgina Whalen from University of Manchester, who is our discussant, to come and give her comments.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be discussant. These are two really fantastic panels that I think raise some very topical questions for us at the moment about how leadership is gendered and about women's leadership in particular. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of work being done on this at the moment in a range of different disciplines, not just development studies, but particularly in international relations and politics. And of course, in the real world, if you like, we've seen a lot of debates at the moment around COVID-19 as a context, I think you'll all agree, where actors and leadership has really come to the fore. So we've seen these big kind of debates in the media and blogs about whether women leaders have performed better than male leaders, you know, talking about Jacinda Ardern, Angela Merkel versus Trump, Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson, and also made us think much more about how far these things are due to actors and how far are structural factors crucial. So if we think about women leaders in New Zealand and Germany, how far is it that well-functioning democratic polities will elect women leaders versus those polities where hyper-masculine right-wing populist leaders come to the fore are those that haven't been performing so well with regard to COVID. So I think these panels raise lots of questions about leadership. What do we actually mean by leadership when we're thinking about women's leadership? It's generally seen as a sort of good and progressive thing. Is that we heard in Rebecca's paper about transformative leadership, or perhaps we're really talking about feminist leadership. Jen Piscopo recently in a blog gave the examples of lots of Republican women leaders in United States governorships who are leading the way in opening up the United States and doing all those things that we may feel in terms of COVID are not constituting good leadership. And also, if we think about other ways of thinking about leadership, are we talking about collective leadership in rethinking leadership? We're talking about collaborative leadership. So how far do we have different notions of what counts as leadership when we're talking about women? I think Shireen Hassim in her plenary yesterday talked about organic forms of leadership at the bottom and how this articulates with leadership at the top, which may come up more in the next panel. And I think it also raises questions about terminology, about the relationship of critical actors to leadership. Are we talking about the same things when we talk about women's leadership and critical actors? How far do women leaders have to be public to be considered leaders? I mean, that came out in the previous Rebecca's presentation, where the assumption was that the women leaders were high profile, making pronouncements with high visibility rather than low key working behind the scenes leaders. So where do we find women's leaders? Is it in different places to where we normally think of leaders, or do they operate in different ways? What are the formal and informal aspects of these this kind of leadership? So I think to focus more directly on the fascinating papers in this panel, Three of them looked at policy change in different sectors, and I've seen these papers evolve, and they're really getting to be fantastic contributions to our understanding now. And they focus on different types of gender equality issues. I know Sohaila mentioned Toon and Weldon's framework. So thinking about education as generally a less controversial area, domestic violence as something that can promote great resistance, but generally has greater success than land efforts to reform land rights. So all three issues elicit different levels of resistance. And what we see in these papers is differing examples of success or failure. And the papers each consider how far the success or failure in the case of Ugandan land reform is due to the nature of the issue, the radicalness of the demands, the strength of opposition, the actions of critical actors, or the alliances in favour or against the change, how effective they are. So we heard quite a lot about resistance and how critical resistance is. And in fact, it would have been great, I think, to hear a bit more about resistance in the Nepal case. And I suppose one of the things I would be interested in hearing more about is how, in each of the cases of the policy change or the defeat, how surprising are these victories? How far were they really achieving the unthinkable? How far were pushing at an open door, if you like? And then thinking about what were the key factors that determine success? How far are they shared across the different issues? How far do they vary? And so how far does leadership actually matter? Back to sort of questions of actors and structure and agency. Is it possible to imagine a context in which the land ownership reforms in Uganda could have succeeded? What would have been needed? Would it have been support from or less opposition? Could those in favour of the measure have done anything differently? So I suppose each paper reflects on how far there are key critical actors. And in the verbal presentations, it actually came out much more clearly who the key critical actors were. It was made clear in the PowerPoint slides for Nepal, and obviously in Rebecca's paper, leadership in a more generalised sense is the focus. But I suppose I'm interested in, and this was mentioned in the verbal presentations, how far do you think these key individuals in the sort of Ugandan and the Bangladeshi cases, how crucial were they? Do they share any characteristics? And I suppose thinking about that then, the focus of the three policy papers was very much on the informal dynamics. How far is the balance, do you think, of success? Is it possible to speculate how far these informal activities were actually crucial? All the papers emphasised informal dynamics, the nature of networks and alliances. I'd love to hear more about Farway, how it operates. Does it operate in informal ways? Does it operate in informal ways? And we're seeing actually more widespread discussions of women leadership, how informal dynamics are increasingly being recognised as crucial. So in terms of international relations, I know there's discussion at the moment in terms of the UN of the tea parties that apparently Madeleine Albright and Helen Clark used to run for women, other women UN officials, and much more consideration of informal networking at the G20 done by gender equality activists. So I suppose I'd like to kind of finish by sort of posing some more questions about thinking comparatively across the cases. how far do the cases show similar tactics with similar levels of effectiveness? How crucial were the informal dynamics? And one thing that struck me listening to the presentations is how far was there learning from one policy area to another? I think, Ammon, you mentioned in the Ugandan case that because of the failure for land reform, there were efforts made to change tactics. How far then does sequencing and timing make a difference? In some cases, we saw very long, drawn-out campaigns to try and achieve victory. And also this question of international factors. How far were the role of donors important? That came out in the case of education policy in Nepal. And also, I suppose, not the same as international factors, but kind of, you might think of them as almost external shocks. To the insurgency in Nepal was obviously a key critical factor in ensuring that government changed policy. How do those kind of external dynamics make a difference? And finally, thinking about questions of the framing of the issues. I mean, obviously that's something that came out as very significant in a number of the papers. How far can and did activists frame issues in particular ways in order to counter resistance and get wider support? So, fantastic papers, really interesting issues, and raising a lot of very interesting sort of comparative questions about leadership and effectiveness.
Thank you very much, Professor Georgina Whalen, for your very interesting comments, and also pointing to the difficulty in drawing patterns and comparisons amidst very different contexts and very different externalities, insurgencies in some countries and very slow reform processes in another. We've had some very interesting questions. I was wondering whether we could begin maybe with asking Srilata Batliwala if she would like to come onto the podium, if possible. I'm just trying to figure out if she would be willing to do that, to come onto the podium and ask her question. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'll be very quick because unfortunately I have to step out in a few minutes to prepare for another meeting. I didn't have so much as a question as well. One question I did have is, I had a great deal of difficulty getting into the panel initially, so I don't know if I missed how we're defining informal, but I think it's become clear to me, so I won't table that. I think the comment that I really wanted to share was really in relation to Rebecca's presentation, where, what concerns me is that I look at the equal right to education as a human right. I don't think that's negotiable in any sense, right? And it shouldn't be something we do instrumentally in order to create women leaders. And obviously that's not at all the intention of that research. I understand that. But I just wanted to underscore that that's a basic right. And every child, regardless of their biology, must have access to that. If we want that education, though, to create women who can become transformative leaders for other women, for advancing gender equality, then I feel we really have to interrogate the content of that education. And that's become all the more vital to me today, because with the increasing influence of regressive ideologies and very repressive regimes, and the rise of fundamentalist regimes, the content of education, the curriculum, the pedagogy is a site of major concern, because that is where we have the potential to create a different kind of consciousness, so that women emerging from that education don't proceed to become, staunch soldiers of patriarchy or Islamic or Hindu or Christian fundamentalism. Otherwise, we are simply producing patriarchal leaders who happen to be occupying female bodies, whatever those are. So I just wanted to offer this comment and this caution. We really have to pay attention to how curriculum is being restructured, dismantled, progressive curriculum being taken apart to advance all kinds of regressive agendas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to maybe ask Rebecca if she would like to respond to that question, because there was another question from Joy Clancy also related to the kind of leaders that you're highlighting in your work, which seem to be very positive in terms of the gender role modeling that they're offering. But she remembers Margaret Thatcher, and that was a very different role model. So if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that caution and comment. It's a very, very important point, and something that when we're kind of the whole system reform, curriculum is definitely, and the kind of gender equality in the curriculum is really a very crucial aspect, as you mentioned. And thank you for the comment. Yeah, definitely the kind of two examples there about role modeling were ones given by interviewees, but definitely that kind of importance of, women leaders not necessarily acting for change and progress for gender equality is kind of a really important one, and kind of evidenced by the example I gave a bit about the kind of one of the interviewees spoke about a woman minister who very much was a key blocker for policy on re-entry for girls in education after pregnancy. And so kind of in that dynamic, we can very much see that kind of women leaders are not necessarily transformative, not necessarily those kind of acting for progress on gender equality. And so that's a really important point for sure.
Thank you, Rebecca. There is one more person I'd like to invite to the podium, maybe if Deepak could come up and answer a series of questions that have been posed by Sam Hickey and some other questioners regarding the interaction between the formal and the informal domains in your research. So perhaps you can comment on that. I think I'm just going to publish the question if it's there. Are both required to challenge the most entrenched forms of gender inequality?
Okay. Is that the first question? Well, it's gone again. How do I?
Interaction between the formal and the informal, and are both required to challenge the most entrenched form of gender inequality?
Well, in the case of Nepal, it does seem that because again, can you hear me?
Yes, we can't see you. We can't see your video. We can hear you.
Okay, sometime I don't know what went wrong. Anyway, I think like what I should say is that yes, in the case of Nepal, both have been very instrumental, mainly because of the confluence of the people in power and the people like who are, it has to do with this what you might call an elite group of individuals who belong to a certain social class and caste who dominate every aspect of Nepali society. Media, writing, government, bureaucracy, police, everything. All right. So within this small group, you have people who are closely tied to each other by virtue of various relations apart from the commonality of caste and class. So in that sense, it has been fortuitous that there was this conference that was able to see the agenda of gender equity move forward. Had it not been the case, it might not have been as easily. But of course, one cannot forget, and as a couple of speakers have pointed out, the case of the Maoist insurgency was a major factor in getting the elite. If you can look at it from that perspective, they introduced some radical changes to offset the message that was coming from the insurgency. So in that sense, the working together of these two groups benefited, of course, largely women, but of course their own interests.
Thank you. And while we're bringing on one more of our speakers, Emily, are you there? Yes. Could you perhaps speak to the question about the tendency to water down feminist demands, and that sometimes in order to make the demands more palatable, do we water them down too much? That does that maybe have detrimental consequences for us in the long run? And in particular, someone else, Yun Yang, asked a question. No, this was another question regarding, maybe you can answer that first.
Okay, thank you so much. We note that in the negotiations and the compromises, sometimes certain demands are watered down, especially when you look at the Domestic Violence Act. We note that women's movement worked so hard to articulate domestic violence as unacceptable and brought that conversation in the public sphere. But one of the things that was sort of resisted and finally got out of the legislation was the issue of marital rape, which was strongly resisted by religious leaders who argued that once you are married, there is no way you can start talking of being raped in a marriage context. And as a way of giving in this and taking that, that critical and contentious provision was trimmed off the Domestic Violence Act. And it seemed like that was a trade-off that made the Domestic Violence Act much more acceptable, especially to the male parliamentarians. So there is that fear that once we engage in these compromises and trade-offs, we are likely to lose certain critical pieces of legislation just for the sake of having this reform passed into law. That is the brief I can share. But I had something to pick on, especially from Georgina Georgina Whalen in her discussion when she asked how critical were the individuals in these legislative reforms. I wanted to pick up one, Honorable Miriam Matembe, who was in the co-ownership clause, which was intensely resisted. The character of this female activist, Matembe, a feminist and legal activist, was part of the Constitutional Reform Commission. She was a commissioner. So she knew certain internal dynamics of the constitutional review and knew the clashing interests in there. For instance, that there was Buganda Kingdom at the time, which wanted to secede from Uganda. So she drew on in the middle of the activism, and she told us in an interview that she threatened the Speaker of Parliament if the Speaker did not accept to put on the order paper the co-ownership clause. She was ready to mobilize women to support the kingdom in its demand for secession, which she knew the state was really not going to accommodate. And she said that was some form of blackmail, which enabled the clause to be accepted on the floor of parliament. So that was step one of success. So the character of the person and her history of engaging with the state enabled her to bring this reform on the floor of parliament, even if it was lost in the last debate.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have actually come to the end of our time. Can I just hand over to Sohaila if she wants to answer? There are many more questions that I'm afraid we won't have the time to answer all of them. Clara McLaughlin has asked an interesting question about methodological lessons we have from how these contesting narratives are being framed, and how do we methodologically pursue this in our research to try to come up with robust findings. Maybe you want to comment on that before we close? Thank you, Sohaila.
Sure. Just to say that, of course, technology means that it requires a longer time than what we envisioned in terms of presentation, and also then moving the slides and everything else. All the questions are very, very interesting. Please feel free to contact us individually, because I know there are specific questions about Nepalese women on inheritance, and I would have liked to have given the floor to my co-author Maheen to give her views. But just to say very quickly, a few things I wanted to touch on. One is, of course, Kate's question around unpaid care and whether that was sort of contested. The issues we looked at did not necessarily touch on it, but it is a very contested issue, as you know, in any cases when you talk about economic empowerment. So Kate, we can have a separate chat around that. Claire, that is a very interesting question methodologically, and that was a challenge that we sort of faced in qualitative research. We had to systematically look at secondary documents and look at sort of what are the framings that are being used thematically. So how are you justifying and legitimizing your claim? So whether that's parliamentary debates, whether that's specific manifestos, whether that is about what women's movement actors were saying publicly, and then also the oppositional actors. So the lesson is, of course, you kind of need to think how deep, which are the critical sources, how, and also thinking about the different framings around the demand. Here I got quite a bit of help from Vivian Schmidt, and also in organizing the research, Sam was a vital part, and so using Schmidt's idea, sort of the categories to look at what's normative, what is the paradigmatic framing, what's the framing around problem solving, which is that framework was very useful. We needed to adapt it to our own research, and it is in our book, the edited volume that is available from Routledge. It's called Negotiating Gender Equity in the Global South, the Case of Domestic Violence Policy. It's open access, so you can freely download it. And this is in chapter 2, and then also in chapter 10. So it's a great way of looking at how do you do this if you are using qualitative methods. Having said that, just to reflect on sort of it's just the issue about how much do actors matter. I mean, we know actors matter, but how do they matter? Amun has already answered it. But it's also sort of unpacking the structure you are sort of working in, and sort of thinking about how do you then understand the relations between the formal and the informal. Informal will help you get into things in specific ways, and actors matter there. But if the formal structures are completely against you, then it becomes very, very difficult. So yes, we do say the right people at the right time in sort of the right sort of confluence of factors, of course, but then how does it play out? And then in a comparative context, then what are the lessons if you really want to move forward? But thank you all so much for such brilliant questions and for being patient with us. We do have the second session at 2:00, which looks at Pakistan, Peru, Eastern Europe, Sudan and South Africa, looking at how feminist movement actors are mobilizing in very difficult contexts and what's the nature of leadership there, and sort of how they're facing down backlash, and how do oppositional actors, some of you wanted to know about resistance, how do they act? Much more details in there, so please do join us at 2.
Thank you very much, Sohaila. We're going to try and keep all of your questions so that maybe during the discussion in the afternoon session, we'll be able to address some of them also. But thank you very much for all of you for your attendance and patience during this session. I hope you enjoyed our presentations. And thank you very much, Professor Georgina Whalen, for your discussant comments, and to all of you who have participated. And we hope we can see you in the next session later today. Thank you, Sohaila.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you to all. And thank you, Douglas.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Douglas, for your help.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second session for the panel, Gatekeepers and Game Changers, How Women Matter in Promoting Gender Equitable Change. We had a very exciting session in the morning, looking at cases in Uganda, Nepal, Bangladesh, and also looking at how education matters for creating women's leadership, and very exciting discussion and comments. So we are very excited about the second session, which looks at feminist activism in difficult and challenging contexts, particularly where conflict is happening and where civic space is shrinking. We have 4 exciting papers, and these papers, what ties them is not just what's happening in terms of what are the activists doing and the strategies they're they're using to promote gender equality issues. It's also, there's a focus across the papers in terms of the focus on the resistance and the resistors as those who don't like the issue of gender equality, what strategies they are using, what's the nature of the pushback and backlash. I know backlash has been a hot topic that people are taking notice now, so this becomes very important. So we are looking forward to very exciting presentations and the panel. I just a few things. If you're having technical problems, Douglas is here with us. Use the text chat to communicate with him. What we are going to do in terms of how the panels are going to run is we will have presentations, and after the presentation, we have our discussant Georgina Whalen giving us comments on what she has heard. And then we'll open the floor for discussion. Just because the Q&A is later doesn't mean you shouldn't keep the questions coming. Use the questions function to type in the questions, and we will keep an eye on that, definitely. So basically, let's see how this rolls, and I'm very excited, and I'm sure that you will also be stimulated. So I will bring up our first speaker, who is Aisha Khan, she's also the convener. Co-convener with me of this panel. She's based at CSSR in Pakistan, and she has 2 of her co-authors here for the paper, Asia and Kamal. So Aisha will be presenting. Aisha, you have about 12 minutes, so let me bring you up.
Thank you, Sohaila, and to all of you who are attending the panel today. My presentation is based on research that we conducted under the Action for Empowerment and Accountability Research Program, which is convened by the Institute for Development Studies in the UK. We examined the conditions here in this research under which women's social and political action contribute to strengthening empowerment and lead to gender equity outcomes. Next slide, please. The Pakistan research was a qualitative study of women's leadership in protest politics in Pakistan. I was supported in this work by my co-authors Asia, Javed, and Komal Kidwai. They co-authored the paper and are here with us in the audience today. Some key concepts framed our understanding of Pakistan and the politics of protest. The first is fragility and conflict. Pakistan is fragile in multiple ways. Beyond its weak political and governance framework, fragility extends to deep rifts within our social and economic environment, and a growing tendency of authoritarianism within the newly democratic political but heavily militarized establishment. Although the worst of our conflict with the Taliban-led insurgency in the northwest, bordering Afghanistan, might be over, in the name of improving security, the government has nonetheless closed down many large NGOs, restricted academic and media discourse, and increased the surveillance and monitoring of digital spaces. Our view of contentious politics draws on Charles Tilley's framing. We examined protests which had an episodic nature, exploring how they developed into collective action, how the demands of women involved in these episodes changed and evolved over time, and what outcomes they achieved. Not all of the episodes were explicitly feminist, yet we found that where women were involved in protest actions, the attention to gender empowerment issues grew over time. Women's demands for greater voice and agency and calls for the state to be accountable for violations of their rights appeared to grow as the protests gained momentum. Next slide, please. We asked whether the constraints posed by gender norms, the fragility and conflict context, and closing civic spaces provided new opportunities for women to exercise leadership through collective action. And if so, how did they exercise this leadership? Our methodology was qualitative, relying mainly on key informant interviews with women leaders from episodes identified through media searches. We selected protests in the public domain with participants over the last 2 years in which women had been prominent. We also attended some protests and analyzed the content of women's public speeches. Next slide, please. The first picture that you see on the upper corner left of your screen is of the Aurat March. This began as an initiative by young feminists in Karachi to mark International Women's Day, to protest the lack of justice in Pakistan for women. It was inspired by the global Me Too movement, but brought together women from diverse causes and organizations on its platform. These annual marches, there have been 3, bring together thousands of women in more cities of the country every year. They demand sexual rights and freedoms, employment, worker condition rights, housing, security, and they call out the misogyny in their midst. The marches have brought more women and trans people onto the streets than any other feminist mobilization during this generation. Religious groups, though, and the far right, have engaged in a powerful social media backlash against them, and they even tried to ban this year's marches in the courts. They were not successful in doing so. On the top right of your screen, you will see a photograph of a protest in the small city of Quetta, where the ethnic and religious minority group called the Hazaras have been subjected to regular terrorist attacks by Islamic militant groups. The attacks have varied in frequency over the last decade, killing hundreds. Finally, women felt compelled to risk their own safety to protest in the streets, demanding that the government provide their community with security. These protests grabbed international and national attention to their cause, and the episodes continue in today. Every time there's a killing, an attack, they come out to the streets to protest. The Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, though, the picture at the bottom of the screen, is a much larger ethnic and rights-based social justice movement that emerged from Northwest Pakistan in the aftermath of the conflict with the Taliban. Although it is a youth-led movement demanding civil and political rights for the Pashtun people, the cause has mobilized women to protest on the streets of Peshawar, which is the provincial capital. This is unusual given gender norms, which mostly keep women within the private sphere. Because PTM, as it's known, has criticized the military and its tactics and called for hundreds of missing persons to be returned, it is now virtually banned. Still, it continues, with a number of women amongst its most prominent voices. Next slide, please. In 2018, a 7-year-old child from the Punjabi town of Kasur was raped and murdered. The Zainab case, as it became known, evoked national outrage and widespread media coverage. Riots erupted in Kasur, shopkeepers went on strike, and even the Supreme Court took notice and demanded immediate police action. Interesting about this is that women from civil society NGOs that work on sexual violence, government officials, and politicians from mainstream parties, they came onto the street protests and helped to lead the advocacy efforts to improve the law and strengthen the criminal justice process. And finally, the protest with the most extensive and long-standing mobilization is one of workers' rights. The lady health workers are the government's primary community-based healthcare providers, and they number now over 100,000. Over the last decade, they began to organize sit-ins and protests to demand better salaries and work conditions. Their leader, who you see here, built this collective action into a formal workers' association, and most of their demands have actually been met. Next slide, please. So what are the constraints that women participants report when they engage in collective action? Can we identify any commonalities and patterns? We found, yes, there is a double fear factor for many women. That is, they fear the police action and backlash from the public for airing their grievances, but they also fear backlash at home. Many come from highly patriarchal families. Their fathers and brothers may stop them anytime from going out or accuse them of bringing shame to the family by raising private issues in the public domain. Women also face a very real risk of bomb attacks, violence, and police brutality. Many of the grievances are directly addressed to the state for failing to provide them with security from Islamist forces or for acting with impunity in the name of imposing security. And the backlash is often severe. Women organizers of the Aurat March have been attacked by right-wing leaders for being un-Islamic and threatened with charges of blasphemy, which is punishable by death in Pakistan. Even male allies who support many of these causes might have a mixed view of women's participation. On the one hand, they appreciate the support. On the other hand, they're reluctant to send their own female relatives to protests, and they might speak disparagingly of women who exercise leadership and voice. But there are important strategic commonalities too. Women are making use of these opportunities afforded by their contention to force an entry into the public domain. They argue their grievances are so severe, the cause so urgent, that they are forced onto the streets. Across the gendered contentions that I've described above, we found that women use performance as a powerful way to articulate their claims. For example, Hazara women laid the bodies of their dead relatives on the street in the freezing cold for days after a particularly extreme terrorist attack, and they refused to bury them until the government promised to protect their community more effectively. There are two elements of women's leadership, though, that I'd like to draw special attention to today. One element is how many women leaders we spoke to saw informal politics of protests as interlinked with the formal political process, and they wanted to play a role in both. The other is that women leaders from different contentions were networked with one another and helped to galvanize support for each other's causes. Next, please. In other words, women leaders understand how to use the power of contention to address their grievances through formal politics. They often comfortably move between one, contention, and the other, active party politics. Bushra Gohar, whose photograph you see here, has been an activist, for example, with the feminist movement for the last 30 years, but she's also a development professional. She is also a former elected member of the National Assembly. She was, until recently, the only female vice president of the Awami National Party, a major political party in the country, from which she was forced to resign because of her outspoken support for PTM. However, her political profile helped to raise the credibility of PTM and reflect its broad appeal amongst Pashtuns. So what is her view of formal politics? As she says, and you see here, you see men tend to compromise and they are also into power politics. But when women enter politics, they bring different dimensions. I mean, mine was really a human rights-based politics. Next slide, please. We found a deep connection between contentious and formal politics. Each was a force used to strengthen the possibilities of successful claims making in the other. Women leaders like Bushra see formal politics as an activist arena in its own right. In a sense, the arena of contention extends to the formal domain. Women like Bushra are ready to move between the two if the cause requires them to do so. Women's protest action, while prominent, visible, and impactful, was not the only claims-making strategy in their repertoire. Protest groups employed direct advocacy with politicians and policymakers. They initiated court actions. They started new organizations, built coalitions with civil society, all to support their contention. Some protesters held political or government office, as I mentioned in the child sexual abuse case. Hazara women, for example, combined the backing of their local political parties with their experience of NGO work to very carefully mobilize community support for their street protests. As one community-based mobilizer for the Aurat March said, politics is very difficult and it really plays with your conscience. But if we move back, we will have to leave certain things unturned, and I don't want to do that. And she has now entered politics in a formal way. We found women leaders support for more than one type of contention. Some were feminist activists in particular, and they had already established feminist networks at the local and national level. They were more confident to take up leadership roles in the other contentions that I've mentioned. And they leveraged their feminist networks, their NGO and civil society networks, and their alliances with formal political parties to build support for these contentious episodes. Next slide, please. And this is my last one. So what is the connection that lies between these two very different images? One is a slogan from the Aurat March in Karachi, consent in the sheets, dissent on the streets. The activist is wearing a mask of an image of a feminist and human rights lawyer known as Asma Jahangir, who was the leader of the women's movement. The march brought together women from all the gendered contentions I've discussed here, but on a platform that was explicitly feminist and led to a great deal of backlash in the media. Now, the other image is an artist's portrayal of the cause that lies behind the PTM. A mother from the tribal regions bordering Afghanistan holds up a photograph of her son abducted by the military. But there is a network of women leaders behind the scenes that connects these emerging sites of political protest and contention, who support one another's grievances and demands and magnify each other's voices. Where spaces for airing of grievances are shrinking, as they are in Pakistan, the pressure on emerging women leaders are also increasingly severe. Thus, as Bushra Gohar says, we have to be everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. That was, fantastic in terms of giving us a flavor of the different types of contentions, but also the link between the formal and the informal, but also fantastic visual images that will connect to Tessa's presentation later that's coming up. So we will move on to the next presentation, which I have the pleasure to invite Tinu Adulkundu-Oja, who is a PhD candidate at University of Pretoria, and with her, Noran Atea will be presenting, who is an Egyptian diplomat, but also a candidate at a PhD candidate at University of Pretoria. Both of them will give us a joint presentation focusing on Sudan and South Africa. They have also been working, they have a long track record working on gender issues in both of their respective countries. So Tinu and Atia, it will be you now with Douglas, if you can help me select their file and bring the presentation up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sohila, and thank you for the opportunity. We'll be presenting a paper titled "Emerging Leaders in South Africa and Sudan, a Key for Equitable Change." This is a paper that is extracted from two theses, PhD theses, and it's actually talking about two case studies of African feminism movement, which basically emphasizes the relevance of historical and cultural context in studying issues of women empowerment and gender equality in different African contexts and countries. Next slide, please. So like I said, the paper basically presents an overview of the development of women movement in South Africa and Sudan with the intention of promoting the influence they have on gender equality and policy change. Next slide, please. With South Africa women have actually made a great landmark in history when it comes to women movement. And quickly, I was able to categorize this women movement into three phenomenon years and decades. The first one was from 1912 to 1956. And here, the main issue which they were able to debate on was different movement that women were able to protest regarding unfair justice when it came to gender inequality and discrimination during this time. Next slide, please. From 1956 to 1990, there was an influx of different protests that was raised regarding women movement. Eventually, by 1956, the women came together nationwide and they were able to formulate the Federation of South African Women. And here, women actually came together and made a massive protest to the Union building, where they had more than 23,000 women protesting on the gender discrimination and the end of apartheid in the country. Next slide, please. And these actually went on and they were able to achieve the Women Charter policy, which eventually was integrated into the Constitution by 1994. Over the decades, we see women leaders such as Ray Alexandra. We saw women like Winnie Mandela and different women leaders fighting together, coming together, Miriam Makeba, coming together from exile to actually ensure that gender equality policies were emancipated within the country. Next slide, please. So quickly, the main role of South African women and what they've able to achieve so far was that till date, South Africa is one of the leading women when it comes to women legislators. They have more than 47 representatives in the legislative, and they've been able to raise different women leaders in the sectors. However, when it comes to this gender achievement, there are still some political and contextual factors that are hindering effective gender equality within the country. Next slide, please. So basically, when it comes to women leadership, especially in the corporate sector, South Africa only have 28% representative women leaders, and women are not trusted. And because of that, women are not really financially included in South Africa. Cultural factors is one of the contextual factors also limiting effective gender equality within the country. Since the country is a multi-diverse country, there is issue of racism and distrust within the system. And you can see that despite women actually dominating the political sector, is more of a mass representative, and there is no substantive representation when it comes to women leadership. And because of this, there is a need for both political societies and civil societies to be integrated and to be included when it comes to making informed decisions regarding gender policies in South Africa. I will hand over to Noran to continue. Thank you. Next slide, please.
With regards to the women of Sudan, as Tino previously mentioned, the Sudanese women movement is an indigenous Sudanese feminist movement that is a byproduct of, and of course, very largely linked to the political and historical context in which it emerged. With regards to the Sudanese women movement, we find it's very much linked to the national struggle and to the political turmoil and conflict that occurred in Sudan throughout the years. Next slide, please. If we look at the historical development of women's movement in Sudan, we find that in the first phase of its inception, in the late 1940s and the independence of Sudan, and throughout after the independence as well until 1989, we find that the women movement focused primarily on political and economic rights. They opted for a gradual, non-confrontational approach that works within the traditional Islamic and cultural system within Sudan. And they have not addressed, women have not addressed civil rights, which have been relegated all throughout the historical history to Sharia and Islamic laws in Sudan. And with the increasing Islamization of the society in the 70s and 80s, a rift has occurred in the women movement, and a widespread of religious women organizations have come to the political scene with clashing interpretations of what gender equality means and what inclusion in the public sphere means for women in Sudan. Next slide, please. With the coming of the Islamist regime to power in 1989, we find that a focus on the political activism and economic rights have led the state to manipulate the civil rights of women, and this was translated in enactment of laws and legislations that severely curtailed women's rights and freedoms and rights of movement as well, freedom of movement. The women movement in Sudan became largely co-opted by the Islamist regime. And most of women activists opted to continue their activism within civil society organizations. Nevertheless, women continued their activism in civil society organizations and with new means of activism, and new issues were brought to the forefront with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or the conflict going on in the south and the west of Sudan. Next slide, please. In this last phase of starting with the Sudanese revolution in December 2018 and to the present phase, which is this transitional government in Sudan, we find that women's roles have been paramount in the revolution and after the revolution. It took many forms, institutional and ad hoc in some cases. It was translated in a number of very progressive articles in the constitutional document, as well as some appointments in the cabinet and the sovereign council. However, women were still ignored during the negotiations that came after the revolution between the different political parties, as well as the peace negotiations that occurred in Juba afterwards. Next slide, please. If we look at the overall roles of women in Sudan, women leaders and their efforts in achieving gender equality in Sudan, even though women activism has focused primarily on civil society organizations, especially during the Islamist regime, we find that there was a number of women leaders in the academia and decision-making institutions, as well as the grassroots level, that helped together bringing the women issues always on the forefront and the political agenda. Next slide, please. And if we look at the process and contextual factors influencing political participation of Sudanese women, we find a number of factors, primarily the legal framework in Sudan, which relegates civil rights and private rights of women to Sharia and Islamic laws, and they have not been amended until this moment. Two laws have been amended for now. The prevalence of patriarchal dynamics within political institutions have largely impeded women from assuming top hierarchy positions in political parties and political institutions. The diversity of Sudanese women movement across religious, secular lines, across generational, class, ethnic lines has led to a clashing and contradicting interpretation of gender equality, and this has impeded the women movement from addressing women issues in a way that would bring it to the forefront and to be translated into policy change. And finally, the cultural factors and the politicization of religion and the various interpretation of Sharia and religious laws in Sudan and has put the women issues at the forefront of this political and highly politicized debate. Next slide, please. Okay, to conclude, we see that from the very two different examples of South African women movements, Sudanese women movement, they're very two different historical, political, and cultural contexts, as well as different stages of the development of the women movement. However, patriarchal dynamics still persist in both countries. They also present this an evidence to the ongoing debate on the critical mass versus critical actors debate that's ongoing on the effective representation of women in Africa. We find that even though the rates of representation in both South Africa and Sudan are among the highest in the continent, however, still this has not been translated into real policy change. And we conclude by saying that unless these process and contextual factors are really taken into account and addressed in the coming future, achieving full gender equality and full inclusion for equitable change for women in both countries will be a bit difficult in the foreseen future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Tinu. Those were very interesting presentations, particularly showing the importance of transitional junctures, but also whether women have a seat at the table. And in a lot of the countries, obviously, in civil society, women are very active. But as the South African case shows, political space is very important, and having a space in political parties do matter. It's not saying that Laura, you showed us the many different forms of leadership that women show, and a lot of the time our focus is on politics, so we kind of forget that there are other spaces. But then political space is, you also need to be in the political space. Yeah. I will, I'm sure you all have lots of questions, so keep the questions coming in using the question function. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the next speaker. So the next speaker is Susana Araujo, who is a research officer in the governance cluster at IDS, and her presentation is on Peru, looking at the movement that happened around education, particularly sex education, the movement that's called Don't Mess With My Kids. And Susana will give us strategies that both sides use, both the feminists to counter it and the opposition, as we were talking about. How do resistors use backlash? How do they have backlash against certain rights, and what is the nature of that? So Susana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Today I'm going to present how women's rights activists resisted and responded gender backlash against the inclusion of gender equality in the Peruvian curriculum. Next slide, please. So fundamentalist groups in Latin America are acting under a new form of mobilization. It is now a transnational movement that opposes what they call gender ideology and also policies around sexuality and education. Next slide, please. They are linked to the most conservative groups of the Catholic and evangelical churches, and they also engage with the political arena, creating civil society organizations, mobilizing people in the streets, and forming unprecedented cross-faith coalitions. Next slide, please. I don't see they coming, but I keep the presentation. This organized backlash has had an impact on the feminist movement in the region. So I explored the strategies of resistance and response that they perform against these opposition groups. I argue that women's rights leaders play a crucial role in these processes. Analyzing the Peruvian case, I show how feminists took advantage of the political context and mobilized their main resource, the capacity to build alliances with government, media, and large sectors of civil society. Next slide, please. So to analyze the Peruvian case, I use the contentious politics approach from McAdam, Tarot, and Tilly, and also the concept of movements and counter-movements from Meyer and Stackenborg. I analyze the four causal mechanisms that explain the mobilization of actors in contention, which are the political opportunity structure, the resource mobilization, the framing of the dispute, and the repertoire of contention. And I also use the concept of critical actors from Childs and Crook. My research relies on secondary qualitative data, so newspaper records, press releases, public communications, which are used in the contentious politics approach. I also use data from the conflict report that the Ombudsperson Office in Peru publishes monthly. Next slide, please. So Peru is one of the countries in Latin America where these opposition groups have more political and media presence. They became a large social movement against the implementation of the gender approach in the curriculum in 2016. During the next 2 years, they performed massive demonstrations, managed to censor 2 ministers of education in Congress, and blocked the implementation of the curriculum through a judicial process. The initial success of the fundamentalist agenda surprised the state and the feminist movement. The gender equality approach was in the curriculum since the 90s, after the World Conference of Education in Jomtien, and it was not a contested issue until that time. But previous gains in 2016 around sexual and reproductive rights represented a major threat for the conservative groups of the evangelical and Catholic churches. So the inclusion of gender equality in the curriculum was, in a certain way, the catalyzer of these threats. It took 2.5 years for the feminist movement to develop a consistent strategy, gaining the support of large groups in society and creating a platform called the Citizen Movement for Gender Equality. Next slide, please. In terms of the political context, the polarization between the Congress and the government represented a major opportunity for both movements. The fundamentalist movement allied with the Fujimorists in Congress, which had the majority of seats, while the feminist movement managed to build a strong alliance with the government. So 2 changes facilitated this. In 2019, the ultra-conservative head of the Catholic Church in Peru was replaced by a more moderate archbishop, and a new head of government was appointed, who was a popular man who had previously supported the inclusion of gender equality in education while he was the Minister of Culture. Next slide, please. In terms of resources, the fundamentalist movement has a large social base, partially explained by their religious affiliation. It also has important financial resources from international donations, mainly churches in Spain and the US, which are not tied to accountability or transparency processes. These resources allow them to buy several TV and radio licenses, implement massive distribution of pamphlets, and advertise their messages in banners all across the country. Of course, pulpits were also used to spread their message. On the other side, the feminist movement in Peru has a smaller social base and is led by a few large NGOs that receive funds from international cooperation. These funds are decreasing since 2005, when Peru became an upper middle income country. So they had to mobilize, the feminist movement had to mobilize their main asset, which was the capacity of their leaders to use influences and informal networks to build alliances with government, media, and progressive actors. Next slide, please. In terms of framing, the feminist movement achieved to change the narrative of the dispute, which was one of the key elements in this contentious episode. The fundamentalist movement mobilized the identity of parents in all their messages. They created a new NGO called Parents in Action, and their massive campaign was called Don't Mess Up With My Kids. In addition, they mobilized a strong feeling, which is fear among population. The message was that the Peruvian children were in danger because the schools would homosexualize them with gender ideology. So in 2018, the feminist movement reclaimed the identity of parents and conformed a new group called Mothers in Action. And in my analysis of statements and public declarations, I find a pattern that suggests a coordinated response among the feminist leaders, the government, and the biggest media group in the country. Gender equality was equated with a better Peru, social justice, and development, while the lack of gender equality was related to sexual violence against children and women, early pregnancy, homophobic bullying, and femicide. Next slide, please. In terms of innovation around collective actions, the fundamentalist movement achieved to develop a brand using blue-pink colors in all materials and performances, and also used social media extensively for connective action online and offline. The feminist movement did not innovate in the repertoires of contention and was not able to mobilize people in the streets or social media around education. Next slide, please. So my conclusion is that feminist leaders overcame this weakness in 3 different ways. They took advantage of the political opportunity structure. They mobilized critical actors within government, media, and civil society, and they changed the narrative of the contention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna, and that was well within time. So well done. And this is such a fascinating presentation because sex education has become such a contentious topic, particularly around sort of the issue around backlash. So, I mean, this is absolutely fascinating to see how it pans out. And in the Latin American context, particularly for us South Asians, the continent seems far away, but actually it's not in terms of how things are done and what feminists are doing and how those who are countering gender equality goals, what they do. So it's my pleasure to invite the last presenter, last but not least, Dr. Tessa Lewin, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and it's particularly linked to the last presentation because she will be talking about narratives and also co-optation of discourses, and particularly focusing on the opposing forces and what they do. So Tessa, over to you. You have 12 minutes. Douglas, if you can pull up the file, that would be really useful. Apologies, Tessa, for the technical glitches I'm experiencing.
That's okay.
All right, over to you.
Some tough facts to follow. So my paper is entitled "Nothing is as it Seems: Discourse Capture and Contemporary Politics." And in this paper, in response to several calls for new theoretical and analytical tools to help us understand the nature of contemporary anti-feminist and anti-queer politics, I developed the concept of what I call discourse capture. So if I could have the next slide. Thanks, and the next slide. I've got quite a few slides, so I'm going to keep whoever's changing them on their toes. So this idea has been developed in conversation with the literature on backlash, and I am particularly taken with Faludi et al.'s conception of backlash comprising a combination of full frontal assaults and undercover myth-making. which, and if I could have the next slide, please. For me, maps onto Foucault's conception of power as both repressive and productive or normalizing, with discourse capture being an expression and recognition of normalizing power. So discourse capture draws on the work of Stuart Hall, Michel Foucault, and acknowledges the importance of discourse as a political battleground and recognizes the extent to which discourse constructs objects of knowledge. It dictates not only how ideas are put into practice, but which ideas are in circulation. And as Kelly Bean writes here, and if I could have the next slide. Language produces material consequences. Arguments create political realities, whether people live or die, have access to power or not, are allowed to marry or not, live in safe neighborhoods or not, is very much determined by the language used for or against them, the manner in which they have been defined. And if I could have the next slide, please. There are no shelters for women without the term domestic violence, for example, no equity training without the phrase sexual harassment. So feminists must reclaim the language of the movement and renounce its uses against women. And next slide, please. So Anne-Marie Goetz has written that gender backlash concerns both the politics of preserving gender inequality and the dismantling of systems to protect women's rights. And discourse capture speaks to the dismantling of discursive systems. Next slide, please. Thanks. So back to the etymology of this idea. In South Africa, the concept of state capture became a ubiquitous term in 2016 when the extent to which Zuma's government had been infiltrated and manipulated by the Gupta brothers and some others became apparent. And the phenomenon of state capture was first identified in a World Bank document in 2000 as an aberration in governance. Next slide, please. But this concept was later taken up and reworked in the South African context. And state capture differs from corruption in both its intention and its scale. And Borat et al. Have referred to it as a silent coup, as a political project that sets up to remove the controls associated with the rule of law. And this idea of an intentional silent coup helps frame the notion of discourse capture. Next slide, please. So within the backlash literature, this is not a new idea at all, and there are numerous existing references to the co-option and resignification of language, and to the reconceptualization of progressive notions, and to the appropriation or erosion or purposeful dismantling of particular frames. And for me, these are all arguably forms of discourse capture. However, next slide, please. What the concept of discourse capture allows us is a lens that systematically links these different forms and allows us to become more alert to their existence, and potentially, as Bean urges, to reclaim the language of the movement and renounce its uses against women. So some examples of discourse capture, and again, if I could have the next slide, please. So the most obvious one, I guess, is the framing of gender as an ideology rather than an analytical category. And if and when the slide comes up, you might recognize this image as the effigy of Judith Butler, who is the alleged architect of gender ideology, that was burned in protests coinciding with her arrival in Brazil for a book launch in 2017. Next slide, please. Okay. And this is an image of a pro-life protester from the United States who labels herself a true feminist in fighting for the rights of unborn women. Now, Halvenebauer and Ziegler have written a fascinating analysis of the way in which pro-life forces have transformed their framing of the abortion issue from one that positions fetal rights against maternal rights to one that emphasizes the bond between the woman and the child, a rhetorical shift that attacks the central claim of mainstream pro-choice activists, that the fetus is not a person. And here we see feminism as what Bean calls discursive fair game and a floating cultural marker drained of specifically political meaning. And this concept is what social movement theorists call frame variation, which is when a counter movement adopts aspects of a movement's discourse while subverting its intent. Next slide, please. On a similar note, this image is a bumper sticker from the 2018 abortion referendum Vote No campaign, which appealed to the Irish public to love both, i.e. both the mother and the unborn child. Brown and Nash analyze this campaign as an example of what they term heteroactivism, an analytical category that examines resistances to sexual and gender rights that seek to reiterate the place of heteronormative family. And in their analysis, they show how pro-life messaging has moved away from banning abortion towards restricting it, and in response to the perceived failures of the previous overtly shaming and overtly religious rhetoric, adopted compassionate, woman-centered discourses. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this image shows a movement and a counter-movement in Latin America. La Marea Verde, or the Green Tide, which is a transnational pro-choice movement that formed in Argentina in 2018 to support a bill to decriminalize abortion. And their central symbol, a green scarf, has now been appropriated by a counter movement, La Ola Celeste, or Blue Wave, who use a light blue scarf. Next slide, please. This image is from an anti-gay protest in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia in 2011. And the sign reads, "Respect our basic human rights as Muslims in this country." And it flips the language of gay rights on its head and subverts it. These protesters are asserting that it is not gay rights that need protection, but Muslim rights that need protection from the threat of gay rights. Next slide, please. And this is my final example. And it's also representative of an anti-queer politic, and it's from La Manif pour Tout, which is a French anti-gender movement that was created to oppose the bill on same-sex marriage in France, a bill that was passed in May 2013, and it's since broadened its remit to the defense of the traditional family. And there are two immediately apparent manifestations of discourse capture just in the name, La Manif pour Tout. The first is La Manif, which is a shortened version of manifestation, excuse my French, which means demonstration. This kind of is a phenomenon traditionally strongly associated with the left in France. And La Manif pour Tout not only co-opted the term manif, but also the language of the same-sex marriage bill itself, which was called Le Mariage pour Tout, marriage for everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, so you'll have to bear with me now because I haven't quite worked this out. I'm still kind of thinking this concept through, but I started thinking about different forms of discourse capture. On the right here are the terms to do with language framings or symbols that appear in the existing backlash literature. And on the left, my own embryonic categorization of the particular examples that I've talked about today. And I've tried to look at both and kind of pull them together against these examples. So one might see the representation of gender as an ideology as a twisting or perversion, or a resignification or reconceptualization. The Irish Love Both campaign as a discourse shifting. The Marea Verde example as discourse mimicking or co-option or appropriation, and the use of rights language in the Malaysian case as an inversion or also an appropriation, and the pro-life claiming of feminism as a hollowing out or purposeful dismantling, and so on. And all this semantic struggling might seem trivial, but I can assure you that it's not. And as cultural politics becomes increasingly significant in formal political processes, so does understanding and recognizing incidents of language appropriation and resignification, etc. And just to reiterate what I said earlier in conclusion, what the concept of discourse capture offers is a lens that systematically links these different forms and allows us to be more alert to their existence, and then potentially, as Bean urges, to reclaim the language of the movement and renounce its uses against women. Thank you.
Policing, sort of delayed. Technology's not helping me. For those of you, if you're thinking why we're joking, we work very closely with each other, so that's why Tessa is joking so much. But Tessa, thank you for that fascinating presentation, because as you point out, it may seem like the semantics are not important. We all know semantics are important. Fake news, alternative reality. You know, we all know very well these days that what you say is important, not just what you're doing, but how you're framing it and justifying it. And the issue here, as we saw in sort of also in the paper in Peru, is that how, not just how things are framed, but how things are hollowed out of their meaning. In terms of gender equality or women's rights, and or even gay rights, and what it means, and that hollowing out is really scary, because one of the powers that women's movement or minority rights movements that they have is the discursive power. That's what we use. We may not be huge in number, or we may not have material wealth like business elites, but we have the power to frame. And when that goes, or that is challenged, that is a key challenge. So thank you, Tessa. I will take you off now. We will sort of go on to the next segment, which is basically, we were hoping to have Georgina Whalen come and comment on in this session also, but she's held up. So we will move on with the question and answer session, and I can see questions already in sort of you have already typed up the questions, but keep the questions coming. Just a very few quick observations, what we saw from the papers. We know that transitions are important, whether that was in the case of Sudan or South Africa, or what we are seeing in Pakistan right now in terms of the political seismic shifts. We have also seen that framing and narratives and creating alternative narratives for both sides, those who are pro-gender equality and those who are not, becomes an important tool and an important weapon and a space for contestation. So how do these strategies are deployed becomes really important to understand if we are going to fight back, and we have seen why languages matter. So having said that, the floor is open. I will look at the question box, but basically what I may try to do is bring you up to the podium to ask your question. So there's a question. Oh, Georgina, you're here.
I've been here all the time.
I couldn't see you in with the participant thing, but then I'm using a laptop screen. Georgina, let's start off with your comments, and then we'll go to the Q&A. You all are in for a treat.
I don't know how that. Great, thanks, Suhaila. I don't know what happened there. It's all these new technological things, but I've been here listening to the presentations, and they were fantastic papers with a great sort of geographical and thematic spread. I won't say very much to allow for questions, but I think they papers really spoke to each other brilliantly and linked back to the previous panel. And for me, there were a number of key common themes that emerged from all of them. I think firstly, of course, we went back to the questions that were raised in the first panel about whether there are different forms of leadership, the nature of women's leadership. Is there something different about organizing outside formal institutions, feminist and collective leadership, but also what links are there? We saw a lot of examples of links between leaders in the kind of organizations outside the state with women activists or women leaders inside the state. And I think we saw in the papers both that took the longer time frame looking at South Africa and Sudan, as well as the paper on Pakistan, we're talking about more recent events, some very important but also themes that are familiar from other contexts, particularly that when we're looking at struggles for gender equality or women making demands in struggles against different forms of sort of authoritarian or totalitarian or conflict contexts or non-democratic governance of all different kinds of, and its aftermath, about women sort of entering the public sphere. And particularly that question about how women's movements can bring together different groups of women, the importance of alliances, of conjunctural coalitions, but also, again, of how these can break down and how fragile these are, which we saw in the sort of the Sudanese case. And secondly, the importance of relationships with other social movements and other organisations like political parties, like the ANC, particularly in the South African case. And then these links between sort of more informal protest politics and formal politics, how we saw and cases of how activists moved between the different spheres and how their roles in different spheres reinforced each other. Again, reinforced again by the role and the importance of networks, which we saw again in the previous panel, and the role particularly of critical actors inside and outside formal institutions. So really bringing us back to notions that have been around for quite a long time of the velvet triangles of activists, politicians, and academics. And I think the Pakistan paper also highlighted the importance of new forms of activism, which came out in some of the other papers as well, particularly social media, the role that social media can play, both in terms of women activists and also of resistance. And I think one of the things I was struck listening to the Sudanese case is this kind of sense of a hopeful story, which we also saw in the Peruvian case. But I wondered then what are the lessons that activists kind of in the current conjuncture can draw from these other examples? How can lessons from other transitions or can lessons from other transitions and conflict situations about how to maintain and build on any gains be useful in the here and now, as well as any lessons about preventing backsliding and backlash? And that brought me to thinking about the emphasis on resistance and particularly backlash that we've seen in this panel, particularly in the form of anti-gender movements. And Tessa raised the importance of discourse capture by anti-gender movements. And I think both the papers, Tessa's and Rosanna's, brought out the clear commonalities and the links between anti-gender movements transnationally, whether financially or in terms of other networks, but also the specificities. And there's a lot of interesting work as well as these fantastic papers thinking about how anti-gender movements operate and capture discourse differently. So ways of thinking about how both the commonalities of these movements and their specificity. So if you think about different contexts, so for example, in the EU, some anti-gender movements have emphasized that they are in keeping with the EU values of human rights. But in Africa, anti-gender movements argue that feminist ideology and gender ideology is a sort of neo-colonial Western project, whereas in Eastern Europe, anti-gender movements argue that gender ideology is linked to Marxism and communism and the previous state socialist regime. So kind of manipulating the contextual specificity in terms of capturing discourse. So I think the papers raised the need to find ways to counter the influence of anti-gender movements in ways that can deal with both commonalities and specificities. And I think that is brings us to this question of how feminist movements can counter anti-gender movements, which is so critical in this current conjuncture that Rosanna's paper brought together so well. Again, another relatively hopeful story that focused sort of firstly on this thing of capturing changing narratives, which is we've seen from Tessa's paper is so important in terms of anti-gender movements capture the discourse. I was wondering about the techniques that were used when you said, Rosanna, that social media wasn't used. Why not in that context? So what are the different techniques to capture discourse? And then, of course, Rosanna highlighted the importance of strategies of building alliances, of taking advantages of the opportunity structure the opportunities that particular structure offers for feminist movements to counter anti-gender movements. So I was wondering what you thought the wider lessons to be drawn from the Peruvian case might be, if there are any. And I suppose for all the paper givers, are there any wider conclusions or lessons that you can draw from your particular case or cases that might have resonance for gender equality actors and feminist actors in other contexts? So this back to the specificities versus the broader themes of different cases.
Thank you, Georgina. And I told you guys you're in for a treat. So, and I forgot to introduce Georgina. So, Professor Georgina Whalen, based at University of Manchester, and all of you are probably familiar with her work. So thank you so much. They were also thought-provoking. So I will take you off the podium now, Georgina, and then we will move on to the question and answer session. But thank you so much for making the time. There are lots of questions coming. So the first two questions are from Maheen, and one is for Aisha and one is for Tessa. So Aisha, the question that Maheen is asking you is, did the transition of women leaders from contentious spaces to formal politics delegitimize them in the eyes of the movement? So I am publishing this question, and Aisha, I will bring you up on the podium to answer it. You're still muted.
Hello, Maheen. Thank you for asking that question, because yes, it is not something that everyone who is a feminist activist is in agreement on. So, for example, in the case of the PTM, there was a divide even within PTM as a movement, both the men and the women together, about whether some of their men should even stand for the elected assemblies. Amongst feminists, sometimes there is a sense that the women who have joined political parties and actually become members of parliament are no longer as responsive to raising activist concerns once they're in parliament. So there is, yes, a tension, but what has happened in Pakistan, and what I was hoping to draw attention to through our work, is that because the pressure right now is increasing, it is as if all progressive voices, whether they're in parliament or they're in contentious politics, are under the same amount of strain. So the numbers are, it's as if the pressure is increasing. Therefore, the alliances, I think, amongst women across the formal and the informal is becoming actually a little bit stronger over the last few years.
Thank you, Aisha, and I hope, Maheen, that answers your question. So I have another question for Tessa, and this is basically on discourse capture. So Tessa, the question is discourse capture or reframing of concepts as a reaction by other actors? I'll publish the question. And Tessa, I will try to get you onto the podium.
Hi, thanks, Maheen. Is it a counter movement strategy? Is that sort of the question? I think Not necessarily. I think I'm trying to think on my feet of, and I have thought of this before, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to right now, of examples of the left capturing discourse. Sahela, I'm sure we've talked about this before. But no, I don't. I mean, I don't think it is just a counter strategy. I think, I mean, if it is, then it can be countered. If that is helpful. And give me a few minutes, and I'm going to think of an example, because I've definitely got a few on file.
So this is what we will be doing. We have a few more questions, so I'll be bringing the presenters up to answer them. But each of you will have 2 minutes at the end of this session to give us your thoughts. That is to the presenters. So any issues you want to respond to. So Tessa,
sorry, Maheen. I was just thinking about, someone has written about Me Too's practicing of naming and shaming. I'm not sure this is quite the same thing, because I'm not sure about the discourse part of it, but I think there is some interesting writing about how Me Too movement has used various strategies from the right, as it were. I'm going to think about that. Thanks. Sorry, Sahela.
No, that's okay. So then I'll take you off the podium, and because the next question is for everyone. So this is basically asking this is a question from Dr. Rakia Maman from Nigeria, and she's asking, how have women or feminist movements in your different study contexts were able to mobilize against intimate partner violence? It shows that this increases during the lockdown. I know Aisha and Tessa have already spoken. Would one of the other presenters want to respond to this? Susanna, I know you were doing something with me on COVID-19 and lockdown, so would you be interested to answer this? Douglas, I cannot see. There you are.
Okay. I don't know. I mean, actually, the lockdown is affecting how feminist leaders and feminist movement organize, but they are trying to mobilize this connective action using social media, and also keeping the advocacy work for protecting and visibilizing first the violence against women, and also advocating for not losing resources for shelters and helplines for survivors of violence. I don't know if that answers completely the question, but I would like to comment and answer Georgina and some of the questions she.
Susanna, can you hold it till like towards the end? I'll give you each one of you a little bit of chance to respond, because Pallavi has a question and I'd like her to pose it.
Sure.
I am trying to find Pallavi. There she is. Pallavi, I'm going to put you on the podium so you can ask your question.
Sure. Thank you. Fascinating presentations by all the panelists. Thank you so much. I don't normally make it to presentations on gender. I'm normally in the industrial policy panel, but this was really a great learning experience for me. So I'm not a gender specialist, but where I'm coming from, and especially for Tessa, what strategy can you deploy when the women's movement is actually co-opted? The entire discourse is captured by fundamentalist nationalism. And I'm really pointing to India here, where, patriarchy and a sort of testosterone-filled nationalism, fundamentalist, jingoist language is used by women within that Hindu nationalist movement as agency providing. What then can the feminist movement in contexts like India, what strategies can they deploy? And this can be, any one of the panelists can answer it. But since Tessa was talking about discourse capture, this is not even capture. This is co-option to such a level that you've lost the women's movement practically. Thanks.
That's put Tessa on the spotlight. I'm loving.
No, I didn't mean to. Not at all.
We convened the MA program together, and we are always at each other's.
Thanks, Sahela. Yeah, I mean, really good question, and I'm sure I can't answer it, but actually, I think one of the interesting points that I haven't really talked about because I haven't explored the literature enough, but I know there is a lot of writing on the link between backlash and popularism and the kind of dumbing down of very complex ideas into these very kind of bastardized and simplistic notions. And there's a very interesting documentary by Adam Curtis, who I'm a massive fan on, called Hypernormalization, which basically argues that we're all kind of implicitly kind of culpable in this political dumbing down, which I think is quite an interesting argument. And as to how we counter it, I think the first thing is that discourse doesn't exist on its own, right? This is all about the interactions between formal institutions and informal institutions and discursive ones, and so any strategy has to be everywhere, as someone said I think that was in your presentation, Aisha. And so there are multiple fronts on which this must be fought. I don't know. I mean, yeah, every platform, social media. And I suppose it's a process of maybe both recomplexifying a language that has been emptied out, but also finding better ways of more simply representing complex ideas and challenging these kind of ridiculous ideas that you know that gender is an ideology. So yeah, good question. I wish I could answer it. I'm sure other people can. So Helen, for example.
Yeah, you read my book and you will see how I talk about strategy. But yeah, being everywhere is an issue. But it's also sort of understanding what are the configurations and where are the, and I'm sounding incredibly vague here, but power configurations in different countries, like in India, how it's happening and the shift is creating possibilities, and it's also closing down certain things. So it's closed down spaces for certain groups, certainly the progressive alliances that we think about, and also certain heightened contexts and certain laws have been passed. We know who's in power. We also know sort of what their intentions are in terms of deployment of the nationalist sort of discourse and sort of what it also means. Parallelly, you have a public health emergency going on. For certain groups, the space has been shrinking for a while. It's not just BJP, it's been shrinking over time. So also understanding that and not just having simplistic assumptions that, oh, this political party did it. Yes, Trump has heightened certain things, but trends were there. So it's sort of countering partly, I think Tessa is right in terms of nuancing what we are saying. But at the same time, we saw in the UK election too much nuances, and then you lost people. So you also have to have that simple story. You have to have the analysis. You have to have your alliances and coalitions. You have to understand sometimes you make practical compromises. You can't just be idealistic and say, oh, well, we are never going to talk to those groups. Doesn't matter. It's a long fight. And you have to be strategic, but at the same time, your analysis has to be really great. And we see a lot of unruly politics happening right now in terms of street mobilizations, and it's fantastic what you're seeing, and what you're seeing in terms of Black Lives Matter and other like in Hong Kong, what's happening, and sort of against repression in a lot of context where state is using forces, which is great, but we cannot lose the policy space either, or the political space. It's a battle both culturally and also in terms of policy. And we cannot afford to lose any of those battles. So yeah. So that's my 2 cents, but I think I want to give sort of each participant, because I don't see sort of questions coming up right now. So each participant, I will give you about 2 minutes each to give us quick reflections on if you have any final thing to say, or you want to respond to a certain question that was raised. So make your choices. I will give the floor to Noran and Tinu first. And then Aisha, then Susanna and Tessa. So
thank you so much. Thanks so much, Sohila. So on my part, as I've said earlier on regarding South African women movement, you can see the difference between the women movement before apartheid and the women movement after apartheid. Before apartheid, women movements were more involved and there were more substantive active participation, which actually enforced and led to policies that liberated gender equality. However, after colonization, it's more of mass representation now. Yes, they've been able to implement and to rule gender policies that actually allow women to be part of informed stakeholders or active participants within the society. However, they are not really included when it comes to making relevant implementation and relevant gender policies that is actually affecting the women. So on my current study on financial inclusion on South African women, with my interviews with different policy makers and stakeholders in South Africa, you could see that different movements have erupted over the decades. However, till date, there is no concrete movement, although the ANC has 50-50 representative when it comes to gender. There's actually a lot of women representation there, but there is no active participation for these women leaders to be actually included in the gender policies that affect them within the country. So this is actually a serious issue. South Africa is a leading role. Statistically, you can see they have good representation, they are financially included, and all those things. But when it comes to monitoring and implementation, they're actually very, very low and way behind. And it's high time they actually allow more women activists to actually be part of the stakeholders and decision makers in order to make sure that there is proper implementation when it comes to gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Tinu. Noran, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so I'm going to comment on Dr. Gina's question on what are the lessons learned.
I'm closer to the mic.
Okay, sorry. The lessons learned we see from the Sudanese example, and what are the lessons learned that women activists in Sudan are taking from their history? For now, there's a civilian government in place. It's a transitional phase, and women are rallying around a number of issues, particularly civil rights issues. They have learned their lessons from not focusing on the political representation, which is already in the constitutional document and in place in the appointments in the cabinet and the sovereign council. Now they're focusing more on the civil rights and the issue of family law, the public order law, and all these laws that have been curtailing their freedom of movement. We see more coalition building among women across the board. However, we still see a no vision for the role of Islam or the role of religion with regards to the women movement and with regards to the government in general. Still, Islamist women now that are out of government are being excluded from the women movement that's currently in Sudan. Civilians' voices are more prominent. And the potential positive role of Islam in promoting women inclusion and participation, especially when it comes to civil rights and Sharia laws and Islamic laws, is still a contentious issue in Sudan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Noran and Tinu. That was fantastic, and I mean, we all enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I will give the floor to Susanna because Susanna had wanted to make some points. So Susanna, you're on.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just to answer Mahin, I don't know if she's still in the room, but in the Peruvian case, the feminist movement tried to mirror the strategy from the fundamentalist movement in terms of repertoires of contention. So they, 2 years later or after the fundamentalist movement started, they hung out in also banners, but this time with the yellow color. And they kind of followed the same pattern and the same strategy of innovative repertoires from the fundamentalist movement, which I don't know the impact actually, but they tried to do that. And in relation to Georgina's comments, I think in terms of social media and why the feminist movement didn't use this as a tool or a strategy, I think it has to do with the moment of the feminist movement in Peru and the characteristics of the feminist movement. So some authors talked about the division between a small professionalized adult feminists versus just gender justice activism. So there are people who don't identify themselves as feminists, so they are not going to engage with these NGOs who can mobilize in social media. And the other thing is that in 2016, when the Minister of Education announces the implementation of gender in the curriculum, the feminist movement actually was preparing the largest demonstration against gender-based violence in Peru. So the agenda was totally co-opted by this issue, violence against women, and it was coordinated also with the government, media, other social civil society organizations. But the movement was tired and also divided, because they had a confrontation between some upper middle class women leaders of this movement and the basis of the young people in universities or in neighborhoods. So some authors have talked about this, and this is one of the reasons I think they delayed the response in a strong sense to the Contra movement. And in terms of lessons,
1 minute.
I think from the Peruvian case, I think it has to do with framing and how they also did this mirror strategy. They regained the identity of mothers, and that's a very, very powerful identity in Latin America. So I think that was also coordinated with government, media, and other civil society organizations. And that's something I want to explore, actually, how coordinated was this. And yeah, because it seems successful in a certain way. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. That was a fascinating case study and so many questions. So I will take you off now, and I will bring up Tessa if she has any final reflections. So final reflections, Tessa, 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I feel like I've had the floor quite a lot, but I think just to return to kind of Foucault and power and MOVE and this idea of kind of competing hegemonies and things, that you know, a lot of the capture of discourse I feel has been quite undercover in a way. And so two things. One, there is a power to be gained in just revealing these examples and stories, right? I'm trying to end on a hopeful note. And the other thing is that I think the left has been very, very slow because of our earnestness, and people have written about this, like Stephen Duncombe, George Lakoff, in taking these informal and discursive, in particular realms, seriously as impacting on politics. So I think there's something there as well about a plea to progressives to think about this. There's a great chapter in Stephen Duncombe's book about how the right are making things up and the left are kind of earnestly following behind them and studying it. And It's a quote from one of George Bush's aides, which is kind of disturbing, but also quite exciting. So there is something about capturing and taking seriously that space, which I think, you know, protesters are understanding very well now. But that's just one space, and there are others that are ripe for capture and recapture.
Okay, so on that recapturing note, last but not the least, I will give the floor to my co-convener, Aisha, to answer Whitney's question, which was on so much of the gender struggles are relational. So what's the role of men in it? So if you could reflect for that from Pakistan, Aisha, and then we do the thank yous together.
Okay, thank you, Sohaila. And thank you for this question about how men fit in. I think that my response to that fits with Sohaila's own comment about how we must not forget the importance of maintaining presence in policy circles as well. So yes, you have the movements, you have the opposition, but we have to have a voice in policy making. And in the case of Pakistan, certainly, we found that strategic male allies, they don't have to be from one party, they don't have to be across every issue, but at every point, certainly in the last 5-10 years, there have been a growing number of strategic male allies that have helped to bring through some policy reforms. So having said that, that's on one side. On the other side, you have the actual politics on the street and the contentions that I was sharing with you today, in which you actually have new forms of men and women working together towards their claims making, whether it's for their political rights in the PTM or whether it is even on the day of Women's March. We had hundreds of men that came out on the Women's March day as well to show their support for LGBTQI rights as well as for women's rights. So I think there are growing numbers of of cross-gender alliances among the young people in countries like ours that may help to bring, to the last point, a kind of change in the discursive tone of certainly women's rights in Pakistan. There are many more open media engagements, like in social media, where issues are being spoken up about by men. Even, for example, against domestic violence, which another questioner and participant in today's discussion raised. These are areas where men were not speaking before. And now I think we're seeing that with social media opening up, many men feel more comfortable raising their voices in support of these things. So just to close with Georgina's call for trying to understand where we have anti-gender movements in all of our different countries, it's very difficult sometimes to know who is the enemy, right? Because sometimes we're being framed by different lobbies for different reasons. So if we speak up for women's issues in Pakistan, we're part of the imperialist West. Yet in Eastern European, one is lumped with the much derided former Marxist ideology. So it is difficult to play this game and be clear all the time where your allies are and whether it's even possible to stay a step ahead of this battle of the discourses. It's actually a battle of the discourses. And I thank Tessa very much for bringing that out so clearly and eloquently. And I think it'd be useful for all of us to use these concepts going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you for also reminding us to be hopeful. I mean, I think all the panelists did that. They talked about that, but it's also about, just as we talk about the regressive forces and we talk about loss of space and everything else, we also have to remember that people are resisting. We are resisting and resisting in different ways, and we are seeing new allies, new sort of groups of people that we didn't see before, and that is definitely a space for hope. As long as you're fighting, you have not lost the battle. So it's very important. And the other thing is important that we have been talking about as researchers. It's important to document because forgetfulness is easy. Also, people forget easily. So unless you document what is going on, what works, what has worked before, you would lose it. So I'm hoping our our papers contribute to that documentation and to prolonging the struggle. Having said that, I would like to thank all of you for coming to the afternoon session, but also those who came to session 1, to the panelists for presenting their papers, to Georgina Whalen for her brilliant comments in both sessions. It's been such an exciting panel, and I'll hand over to Aisha to close the session.
Thank you very much to all of you for joining in, raising questions, listening to us discuss our research. Thank you, Georgina Whalen, for your wise and wide-ranging feedback on our very diverse set of empirical studies. And thank you to Douglas for helping us out with the technological hitches in the background, and all of you participants for bearing with us. It's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you for this wonderful attendance we've had, more than we expected on this very experimental online conference of today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.